In the beginning, there was only silence and the whisper of wind through ancient forests. Long before history learned to write their names, before empires rose to chronicle their movements, the people who would become the Slavs lived in a world of river valleys and endless woodland, their story hidden beneath layers of time that archaeology can only barely penetrate. They emerged not with thunder or conquest, but gradually, like morning mist rising from the marshes of Eastern Europe, coalescing into a presence that would one day span a continent. The question of origins has haunted scholars for centuries, a puzzle with pieces scattered across millennia. Where did the Slavs come from, and when did they first appear as a distinct people? The answers lie somewhere between hard evidence and educated conjecture in a period so remote that written records simply do not exist. What we know comes from linguistics, from archaeology, from the faint traces left in soil and bone, and from the retrospective accounts of civilizations that encountered them much later. The Proto-Slavic language, ancestor to Russian, Polish, Czech, and a dozen other tongues, began to diverge from other Indo-European languages perhaps 3,000 or even 4,000 years ago, though pinning down exact dates remains an exercise in probability rather than certainty. Most scholars place the original Slavic homeland in the vast territories between the Vistula River in the west and the Dnieper River in the east, a region encompassing parts of modern Poland, Ukraine, and Belarus. This was a land of mixed forest and forest steppe, where birch and oak gave way to grasslands, where winters stretched long and harsh, and summers burst with brief but intense fertility. Here, in this intermediate zone between the deep forests of the north and the open steppes of the south, the Proto-Slavs developed their culture over countless generations. They were not nomads thundering across plains, nor were they city builders raising monuments to their gods. They were forest dwellers, river people, farmers who cleared small patches of woodland to plant their crops, then moved on when the soil exhausted itself. The archaeological record from the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age in this region reveals communities that lived in modest settlements, clusters of semi-sunken dwellings that provided shelter against the bitter cold. These were people who knew how to work iron, who crafted pottery with simple geometric designs, who buried their dead with care, if not with lavish goods. The Lusatian culture, flourishing between roughly 1300 and 500 BCE, is often considered a possible ancestor or close relative of the early Slavs, though the connection remains debated. What is clear is that the inhabitants of these lands were part of the broader Indo-European world, speaking languages distantly related to those of Celts, Germans, Balts, and Indo-Iranians, yet developing their own distinct identity in relative isolation. Life in these primordial times revolved around the rhythms of nature with an intensity that modern minds struggle to comprehend. The forest was not merely a resource but a living presence, populated by spirits and forces that demanded respect. Rivers served as highways and boundaries, their courses changing with the seasons, flooding in spring with snowmelt, freezing solid in winter to become roads of ice. Communities remained small, perhaps a few dozen, or at most a few hundred souls, linked by kinship and custom rather than formal political structures. Authority resided in elders, in those who remembered the proper ways of doing things, in individuals who demonstrated wisdom or prowess rather than in inherited positions of power. The Proto-Slavs shared many characteristics with their Indo-European cousins, while developing peculiarities that would mark their descendants for millennia to come. Their language retained archaic features, a complex system of cases and verb aspects that suggested a culture attuned to subtle distinctions in action and relationship. They organized society around extended family groups, with the patriarch wielding authority, but within bounds established by tradition and communal consensus. Land belonged not to individuals but to the community, though families maintained use rights passed down through generations. This collective approach to property and decision-making would resurface repeatedly in Slavic history, from medieval village communes to the socialist experiments of the 20th century. Agricultural practices remained relatively primitive by the standards of Mediterranean civilizations, but they were well adapted to the environment. The slash-and-burn technique, clearing forest patches through fire, allowed cultivation of rye, millet, and barley in soil enriched by ash. After a few seasons, as fertility declined, the community would move to a new area, allowing the forest to reclaim the old fields. This system, known as shifting cultivation, required large territories and kept population densities low, but it matched the realities of dense forest, poor soils, and a short growing season. Livestock, particularly cattle and pigs, supplemented agriculture, foraging in the forests and providing not only food, but also the raw materials for clothing, tools, and countless other necessities. The Proto-Slavs existed on the periphery of the ancient world's great civilizations, far enough removed to avoid direct contact with the literate cultures that might have recorded their existence. While Greeks built the Parthenon and Romans conquered the Mediterranean, while Chinese emperors raised the Great Wall and Indian sages composed the Upanishads, the Slavs lived their lives in anonymity, neither conquering nor being conquered, neither writing history nor appearing in the histories written by others. This isolation was both blessing and limitation. They were spared the upheavals that accompanied imperial expansion, the disruptions of long-distance trade networks, the cultural impositions of more powerful neighbors, yet they also remained for centuries in a technological and cultural holding pattern, changing slowly, adapting to their environment rather than transforming it. The relationship between the early Slavs and other Indo-European groups in Eastern Europe remains murky, a tangle of migrations, cultural exchanges, and gradual differentiations that occurred over such long periods that clear boundaries cannot be drawn. To the north, Baltic tribes spoke related languages and followed similar ways of life, enough so that distinguishing early Slavic from early Baltic sites challenges even expert archaeologists. To the west, Germanic tribes pushed gradually eastward, sometimes peacefully mingling with the indigenous population, sometimes displacing them through conflict. To the south and east, Iranian-speaking peoples, particularly the Scythians and later the Sarmatians, dominated the steppes, their mounted warriors and nomadic culture representing a fundamentally different approach to life from that of the settled forest dwellers. Contact with these steppe nomads, despite cultural differences, left marks on Proto-Slavic society. Loan words entered the language, terms related to horses, warfare, and pastoral life that the forest farmers had little need to invent themselves. Trade goods, however modest, passed between worlds, amber from the Baltic moving south, metals and luxury items traveling north. Perhaps most significantly, the constant presence of steppe peoples to the south and east shaped Slavic defensive strategies and settlement patterns, encouraging locations deep within the forest where cavalry could not easily penetrate, where rivers and swamps provided natural barriers against raiders. As the centuries rolled past, as the Roman Republic became an empire and that empire reached its zenith, the Slavs continued their quiet existence beyond the frontier. Roman geographers knew vaguely of peoples living in the forests beyond Germania, beyond Dacia, but their knowledge remained imprecise, filtered through multiple intermediaries, confused by the multiplicity of tribal names and the fluidity of population movements. The name Venedi or Veneti appears in classical sources, referring to people living somewhere east of the Germans and west of the Sarmatians, and some scholars identify these Venedi as early Slavs. Pliny the Elder, Tacitus, and Ptolemy all mention them, but their descriptions remain frustratingly vague, offering little detail about culture, language, or way of life. The first clear linguistic evidence of Slavic as a distinct language family emerges only gradually, as Proto-Slavic began to differentiate internally, as communities separated by distance and geography started to diverge in speech patterns and vocabulary. This process accelerated during the first few centuries of the Common Era as the Slavs began to expand from their original homeland, pushed and pulled by forces both internal and external. Population growth, however slow by modern standards, eventually created pressure on available land. Climate fluctuations, particularly warming periods that made previously marginal lands more attractive, opened new possibilities for settlement. And crucially, the great migrations that convulsed Europe during the decline of the Roman Empire created both opportunities and necessities for movement. The Gothic expansion eastward in the early centuries, CE, brought Germanic tribes into sustained contact with the Slavs, sometimes as conquerors, sometimes as trading partners, always as agents of change. The Goths established a kingdom north of the Black Sea, incorporating or displacing various peoples, including Slavic tribes. When Hunnic invasions shattered this Gothic realm in the late 4th century, a domino effect rippled across Eastern Europe. Peoples displaced from their traditional lands sought new homes, setting off chain reactions of migration and conflict. The Slavs, living in the path of some of these movements yet positioned to take advantage of the chaos, began their own expansion, a process that would transform the ethnic map of Europe. Yet even as the stage was set for this expansion, as the long period of obscurity neared its end, the Slavs remained what they had always been, forest farmers living in small communities, worshipping gods whose names we can only partially reconstruct, following customs that left few traces in the archaeological record. They had no writing, no cities, no centralized authority that might leave monuments or administrative records. Their priests, if they had specialized religious practitioners, built no temples of stone. Their chiefs, if they existed as more than temporary war leaders, erected no palaces. They lived lightly on the land, their material culture deliberately modest or simply reflective of limited resources and technology. The religion of the Proto-Slavs, reconstructed from later sources and comparative mythology, revolved around a pantheon of gods associated with natural forces and celestial phenomena. A sky god, perhaps called Perun, or a name from which Perun later evolved, wielded thunder and lightning, maintaining cosmic order through force. An earth goddess, fertile and nurturing, represented the land itself and the cycles of agricultural life. Lesser spirits inhabited every feature of the landscape, every spring and grove, every unusual stone or ancient tree. The dead remained present, their spirits requiring propitiation, their wisdom sought through rituals we can only imagine. Divination, probably through various means, helped communities make decisions, provided guidance in uncertain times, connected the mundane world with the realm of spirits and gods. This world, balanced precariously between stability and change, between isolation and connection, between tradition and adaptation, would soon undergo transformation. The Slavs were about to emerge from the forests and river valleys to spread across half a continent, to encounter empires and adopt religions, to create kingdoms and write their names into the histories from which they had so long been absent. But in these final centuries before that expansion, in the twilight of the ancient world and the dawn of the medieval, they remained what their ancestors had been for uncounted generations, a people living in harmony with their harsh environment, speaking a language that no outsider understood, following ways established when the world was young. The stage was set, though none could have known it, for the Slavs to become one of the great peoples of Europe, their descendants eventually numbering in the hundreds of millions, their languages spreading from the Elbe to the Pacific, their cultures enriching the broader human story in ways that would have astounded those humble farmers clearing patches of forest with fire and axe. But that story was yet to come, waiting in the uncertain future like seeds, dormant beneath winter snow, ready to burst forth when the proper season arrived. For now, there was only the whisper of wind through ancient trees, the slow turn of seasons, the eternal rhythms of a way of life that seemed as permanent as the forests themselves, yet stood on the verge of irrevocable change. The world that had contained the Slavs for so long began to crack apart in the 5th century, its foundations undermined by forces that had been building for generations. The Roman Empire, that great organizing principle of Mediterranean civilization, had already split into eastern and western halves, each struggling with internal decay and external pressure. Germanic tribes, themselves pushed by peoples moving westward from the depths of Asia, pressed against every frontier, seeking land, wealth, and safety from the turmoil behind them. Into this maelstrom of migration and conflict, the Slavs finally stepped, beginning an expansion that would reshape the ethnic geography of an entire continent. The catalyst came from the east, from the endless steppes that had always been a source of both danger and opportunity. The Huns, arriving like a thunderstorm from Central Asia, destroyed the Gothic kingdoms north of the Black Sea and sent shockwaves through every people in their path. The year 375 marks a convenient milestone when the Hunnic onslaught drove the Goths across the Danube and into Roman territory, but the process was neither instantaneous nor simple. Waves of disruption spread outward from the initial impact, displacing peoples who in turn displaced others, creating a cascade of movement that took decades to play out fully. The Slavs, living in territories that became a highway for these migrations, found their world transformed whether they willed it or not. Yet the Slavic expansion was not merely reactive, not simply a matter of being pushed by others. Population growth within the Slavic homeland had created pressures that made expansion attractive, even without external compulsion. The slash-and-burn agricultural system, requiring ever more territory as population increased, naturally encouraged movement into new lands. Climatic improvements during the 5th and 6th centuries made previously marginal areas more hospitable to agriculture, and perhaps most importantly, the political chaos engulfing Europe created power vacuums, regions where centralized authority had collapsed, where land lay available to whoever could seize and hold it. The Slavs moved in multiple directions simultaneously, following river valleys and forest corridors, advancing slowly but inexorably like rising water. One major stream flowed southward and westward into the Balkans, the territories that had been the heart of the Roman Empire in the east. Another pushed westward into Central Europe, into lands that Germanic tribes had vacated in their own migrations toward richer prizes in Gaul and Italy. A third expanded northward and eastward into the vast forests of what would become Russia, regions so immense and so sparsely populated that Slavic settlers could advance for centuries without encountering significant resistance. The southward expansion brought Slavs into direct contact with the Byzantine Empire, the eastern continuation of Rome that had survived the collapse of its western counterpart. Throughout the 6th century, Slavic tribes raided across the Danube with increasing frequency and boldness, at first seeking plunder, then gradually settling in the territories they had ravaged. Byzantine sources, suddenly confronted with this new presence, began to record information about the Slavs with increasing detail and alarm. The historian Procopius, writing in the mid-6th century, described the Slavs as living in miserable hovels scattered across a great expanse, united by no single ruler, worshipping various gods and fighting with primitive weapons, yet with great ferocity and cunning. These raids disrupted the Balkans profoundly, weakening Byzantine control over provinces that had been securely Roman for centuries. Cities shrank or disappeared, villa estates lay abandoned, the infrastructure of classical civilization crumbled as roads fell into disrepair and aqueducts ceased to function. Into the vacuum created by this collapse, Slavic settlers moved in increasing numbers, transforming the ethnic character of the region. The indigenous populations, descendants of Illyrians, Thracians, and Romanized provincials, either fled southward to areas still under Byzantine protection, intermixed with the newcomers, or were absorbed entirely. By the 7th century, much of the Balkan interior had become fundamentally Slavic in language and culture, a transformation so complete that it endures to the present day. The Slavs who settled in the Balkans did not arrive as a unified people under centralized leadership, but as numerous independent tribes, each with its own identity and territory. The Sclaveni occupied much of the central and western Balkans, while the Antes, another Slavic group, settled further east around the shores of the Black Sea. Within these broad groupings existed countless smaller units, tribes led by chieftains whose authority extended only as far as their personal prestige and martial prowess allowed. Byzantine attempts to play these tribes against each other, to buy off some with gold and incite them to attack others, met with mixed success. The Slavs proved adaptable enemies, learning siege warfare from the Romans they fought, adopting cavalry tactics from the steppe nomads they encountered, yet retaining their essential character as infantry fighters who excelled in ambush and irregular warfare. Parallel to this southern expansion, other Slavic groups moved westward into Central Europe, occupying territories in modern Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Eastern Germany. Here, the situation differed markedly from the Balkans, for these lands had not been part of the Roman Empire, lacked the cities and infrastructure of classical civilization, and were in some cases being vacated by Germanic tribes moving elsewhere. Slavic settlement in Central Europe thus occurred with less violence but no less thoroughness, gradually filling regions that became permanently Slavic in character. The Elbe River became an approximate western boundary of Slavic expansion, though groups settled even beyond this line, eventually to be absorbed by German expansion in the opposite direction during the Middle Ages. The tribes that settled Central Europe would become the ancestors of the West Slavs, the Poles, Czechs, and Slovaks of later history. They lived initially much as their Proto-Slavic ancestors had, in small agricultural communities, clearing forests, planting crops, raising livestock, and maintaining social structures based on extended kinship groups. Yet contact with the remnants of Roman civilization to the south and with Germanic kingdoms to the west gradually introduced new elements, new technologies, and organizational forms that would eventually transform Slavic society. Christianity reached some of these Western tribes relatively early, brought by missionaries from Germanic kingdoms and from Rome itself, though the conversion process remained incomplete for centuries, with pagan practices continuing alongside nominal Christian observance. The expansion into the eastern forests, into the immense territories between the Baltic and Black Seas, proceeded differently again, for here the Slavs encountered neither imperial structures nor dense populations, but rather scattered Baltic and Finno-Ugric tribes living in ways not unlike their own. The vastness of the region allowed expansion without displacement, settlement without significant conflict. Slavic agriculturalists moved along river systems, establishing villages on advantageous sites, gradually intermingling with indigenous peoples who were either absorbed or pushed further into the northern forests and marshes. This eastern expansion proceeded over centuries rather than generations, wave after wave of settlers seeking new land, until Slavic settlements reached the upper Volga and beyond. These Eastern Slavs would eventually coalesce into Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians, but in the early medieval period they existed as a patchwork of tribes, each identified by distinctive names that Byzantine and later Arab sources carefully recorded. The Polyaenians lived around Kiev on the Dnieper, the Severians to the northeast, the Drevlians in the forests to the west, the Krivichians around the headwaters of the Volga and Dnieper, and many others whose names survive in chronicles even as their distinct identities merged into larger groupings. Trade connected these tribes, particularly the great river routes linking the Baltic to the Black Sea and Caspian, waterways that would become highways for commerce between northern Europe and the Byzantine and Islamic worlds. Throughout this entire period of expansion, Slavic culture retained characteristics established in the prehistoric homeland while adapting to new circumstances and influences. the tribal structure remained fundamental, with loyalty to clan and tribe superseding any broader ethnic consciousness. The Slavs of the Balkans had little sense of kinship with those settling near the Baltic, despite speaking mutually intelligible dialects. Political organization remained rudimentary, with authority exercised by assemblies of free warriors who elected chiefs for military campaigns but maintained essential equality in peacetime. This democratic tendency, this resistance to centralized authority and hereditary privilege, would repeatedly resurface in Slavic history, from medieval city-states to peasant rebellions to modern revolutionary movements. Religion continued to center on nature deities and ancestral spirits, with practices varying by region but sharing common themes. Perun, god of thunder and war, emerged as the most important deity in many areas, his cult maintained by priests and celebrated with sacrifices. Veles, associated with cattle, the underworld, and perhaps commerce, received veneration as well. Female deities connected to fertility, to the earth, to moisture and growth, played crucial roles in agricultural rituals. Sacred groves provided sites for worship, particular trees or stones marked as holy, springs and rivers treated as dwelling places of spirits. The dead received burial with goods they might need in the afterlife, though without the monumental tombs or elaborate grave goods characteristic of aristocratic societies elsewhere. The physical culture of the Slavs during this expansion period remained relatively simple, distinguished more by uniformity across vast distances than by technological sophistication. Pottery styles, while showing local variations, shared basic characteristics: simple vessels made without the potter's wheel, decorated with stamped or incised geometric patterns. Settlements consisted of small villages, rarely exceeding a few dozen structures, each dwelling a semi-sunken house with a stone or clay oven in one corner, walls of wattle and daub, a roof of thatch or bark. Defensive works, when they existed at all, took the form of wooden palisades, surrounded by ditches, erected hastily in times of danger rather than maintained as permanent fortifications. Byzantine observers noted the primitive material culture of the Slavs with a mixture of contempt and unease, contempt for peoples who seemed barbarous by the standards of Roman civilization, unease because these same barbarians proved remarkably effective at warfare and resistant to efforts at control or assimilation. The Slavs refused to fight set-piece battles when they could avoid them, preferring ambushes and raids, melting into forests and marshes when pursued, emerging to strike again when the enemy relaxed. They adapted quickly to new military technologies, adopting better weapons and armor when they could obtain them through trade or capture, yet never abandoning the tactical flexibility that made them so difficult to defeat decisively. The encounter between Slavs and Byzantines produced gradual changes in both societies, a cultural exchange that, despite its basis in conflict, eventually enriched both sides. Byzantine gold flowed northward as payment for mercenaries, as tribute to buy off raiders, as prices for slaves captured in internecine warfare. Byzantine craftsmen, captured in raids or seeking refuge from imperial taxation, brought their skills to Slavic settlements. Byzantine Christianity, though not yet widely adopted, began to penetrate Slavic consciousness through captives, through traders, through occasional missionaries venturing into dangerous territories. The Slavs remained pagan through the 7th and 8th centuries, but the seeds of future conversion were being planted, even as they were being planted among other barbarian peoples across the former Roman world. By the end of the 8th century, the Slavic expansion had largely run its course, not through any decisive victories or defeats, but through the natural exhaustion of opportunities and the consolidation of new settlement patterns. The Slavs now occupied an immense territory from the Elbe to the Volga, from the Baltic to the Mediterranean, a greater expanse than any other European people. Yet they remained politically fragmented, culturally diverse, despite linguistic kinship. lacking the unifying structures that might have transformed their numerical strength into political power. That transformation would require new organizational forms, new ideologies, new contacts with the wider world that would challenge and ultimately reshape the tribal society that had carried them so far from their original homeland. The stage was set for the next great transformation, the creation of the first Slavic states, and the conversion to Christianity that would bring the Slavs fully into the orbit of European civilization. The 9th century dawned on a Slavic world still organized along tribal lines, still pagan in faith, still lacking the political structures that characterized more developed civilizations to the south and west. Yet within a few generations, this world would transform dramatically as the first Slavic states emerged from the tribal confederacies, as Christianity spread across territories that had known only pagan gods, as alphabets were invented and learning began to flourish where illiteracy had been universal. The transformation came through a combination of internal development and external influence, through the ambitions of individual leaders and the pressures exerted by powerful neighbors who saw opportunities in the fluid politics of Slavic lands. The first significant Slavic state to emerge was Great Moravia, a realm that coalesced in the early 9th century in the territory of modern Czech Republic, Slovakia, and parts of surrounding regions. The Moravian princes, descendants of tribal chieftains who had accumulated power through warfare and shrewd alliances, began to consolidate control over neighboring tribes, creating a political entity that transcended traditional tribal boundaries. Prince Moimir, who ruled in the 830s, established a dynasty and forged connections with the Frankish Empire to the west, accepting Christian baptism as part of a diplomatic arrangement that brought both religious legitimacy and dangerous entanglement with powerful neighbors who harbored their own ambitions in Central Europe. The conversion of Great Moravia to Christianity represented a watershed moment, not merely for that realm, but for Slavic civilization as a whole. Christianity brought literacy, for the faith demanded written scriptures and liturgy. It brought new forms of organization, ecclesiastical hierarchies that paralleled and reinforced political authority. It brought connection to the wider Christian world, to the learning and culture that had been developing for centuries in the Mediterranean and Western Europe. Yet the process of conversion raised thorny questions, particularly regarding language and liturgy. The Frankish missionaries who first brought Christianity to Moravia insisted on Latin as the language of the Church, a tongue utterly foreign to Slavic speakers, incomprehensible to the common people for whom the new faith was ostensibly intended. Prince Rastislav, who came to power in 846, recognized both the value of Christianity and the dangers of excessive Frankish influence. In a move of remarkable foresight, he appealed to the Byzantine Emperor Michael III for missionaries who might evangelize in a language the Slavs could understand. The emperor responded by sending two brothers, Constantine and Methodius, men who would reshape Slavic history through their linguistic and missionary work. Constantine, who would later take the monastic name Cyril, was a brilliant scholar who had already undertaken diplomatic and missionary work for Byzantium. Methodius, his older brother, brought practical experience in administration and a talent for organization. Together, they would create something unprecedented, a written Slavic language suitable for expressing the full complexity of Christian theology. Before embarking to Moravia in 863, Constantine undertook the monumental task of creating an alphabet for the Slavic language, a writing system that could capture sounds that neither Greek nor Latin scripts adequately represented. The Glagolitic alphabet, as it came to be called, was his invention, a complex and beautiful script that drew on Greek letters while adding entirely new characters for uniquely Slavic phonemes. Using this alphabet, Constantine and Methodius translated the Gospels, liturgical texts, and essential Christian literature into Old Church Slavonic, a literary language based on the dialect spoken around their native Thessaloniki, which had a large Slavic population. The result was nothing less than the creation of a new literary culture, giving the Slavs immediate access to Christian civilization in their own tongue. The work of Cyril and Methodius in Moravia met with both success and opposition. The common people embraced a Christianity they could understand, services conducted in familiar language rather than incomprehensible Latin. Rastislav found in the Byzantine missionaries useful counterweights to Frankish ecclesiastical and political pressure. But the German clergy, who had been laboring to convert Moravia and who saw the region as properly within their sphere of influence, viewed the Byzantine mission with hostility. They appealed to Rome, arguing that liturgy in vernacular languages was improper, that Latin, Greek, and Hebrew were the only languages sanctified for worship. The brothers travelled to Rome to defend their work, and Pope Adrian II, recognizing the practical value of evangelization in the vernacular, approved the Slavonic liturgy, though this approval would prove temporary. After Cyril's death in Rome in 869, Methodius continued the mission, eventually being consecrated as Archbishop of Moravia and Pannonia. He faced constant opposition from German clergy and endured imprisonment for a time, but he persevered in his work of translation and organization, training Slavic priests and establishing a church structure independent of Frankish control. Yet his success proved fragile, dependent on political conditions that would not long endure. After Rastislav was overthrown and Methodius himself died in 885, the German clergy moved swiftly to suppress the Slavonic liturgy in Moravia, driving out the disciples of Cyril and Methodius and insisting on Latin as the sole liturgical language. The expulsion of these disciples, however, had an unforeseen consequence that would prove momentous. Many fled southward to Bulgaria, where they found a ruler eager to establish a literate culture for his realm. The First Bulgarian Empire, which had emerged in the late 7th century, through the conquest of Slavic tribes by Turkic Bulgars who gradually adopted Slavic language and culture, had already converted to Christianity under Khan Boris in 864. Boris, seeking to consolidate his authority and elevate his realm's prestige, welcomed the refugee scholars from Moravia. They brought with them their texts, their liturgical tradition, and their commitment to Slavonic Christianity. In Bulgaria, they found not merely refuge, but a fertile ground for their work to flourish. The disciples of Cyril and Methodius, particularly Clement and Nahum, established schools and scriptoria in Bulgaria, training new generations of scholars and clergy. They modified the Glagolitic alphabet, creating a simpler script based more directly on Greek letters, the Cyrillic alphabet that bears Cyril's name, though he did not create it in this form. This script proved easier to write and learn than Glagolitic, and it gradually became standard for Slavic Christian literature. From Bulgaria, Cyrillic and the Slavonic liturgical tradition spread northward to other Slavic lands, creating a cultural sphere united by language and faith even as it remained politically fragmented. Far to the northeast, a different but equally significant development was transforming the Eastern Slavs. The vast river systems connecting the Baltic to the Black Sea and Caspian had become major trade routes, particularly the route along the Dnieper River. Scandinavian traders and warriors, the people known in the east as Varangians and in the west as Vikings, had established control over key points along these routes, extracting tribute from Slavic tribes and facilitating commerce between northern Europe and the Byzantine and Arab worlds. These Varangians, while initially foreign conquerors, gradually merged with the Slavic population, adopting the local language while imposing their own political and military traditions. According to the primary chronicle, the principal source for early Russian history, the Eastern Slavic tribes, weary of internal conflicts and seeking order, invited a Varangian leader named Rurik to rule over them around 862. Whether this invitation actually occurred or represents later myth-making remains debated, but the essential fact stands that Varangian princes did establish control over key Slavic cities during the 9th century. Rurik's successor Oleg captured Kiev around 882, establishing it as his capital and creating what would become known as Kievan Rus, a realm that united the Eastern Slavic tribes under a single dynasty, however loosely. Kievan Rus in its early decades remained a confederation rather than a centralized state, with the Grand Prince in Kiev exercising authority over lesser princes who ruled individual cities and territories. The Rurikid dynasty, as Rurik's descendants came to be called, maintained power through military prowess, control of trade routes, and the collection of tribute from subject tribes. The princes and their retinues, their armed companions called druzhina, formed a warrior elite distinct from the common Slavic population, though intermarriage and cultural assimilation gradually blurred these distinctions. The economy of Kievan Rus depended heavily on trade, particularly the export of furs, slaves, honey, and wax southward to Byzantium and the Islamic world in exchange for luxury goods, weapons, and silver. The religion of Kievan Rus in the 9th and early 10th centuries remained predominantly pagan, though the princes maintained contact with both Christian Byzantium and the Islamic Caliphate, and some individuals converted to these faiths. Prince Igor and his successor Sviatoslav worshipped the traditional Slavic gods, particularly Perun, whose cult was closely associated with the warrior aristocracy. Yet the advantages of monotheistic religion, particularly Christianity, became increasingly apparent. Christian states possessed superior administrative structures, more sophisticated legal systems, and greater cultural prestige. More practically, full participation in Byzantine and European diplomacy required religious compatibility, shared assumptions that facilitated agreements and alliances. The decisive turn toward Christianity came under Prince Vladimir, who ruled from 980 to 1015. Vladimir, initially a fervent pagan who erected temples to the old gods and even practiced human sacrifice, gradually recognized that the future lay with monotheism. According to tradition, he investigated Judaism, Islam, and both Byzantine and Roman Christianity before choosing the Byzantine rite. The primary chronicle tells colorful stories about his decision-making process, including his rejection of Islam because it forbade alcohol, and his embrace of Byzantine Christianity after envoys reported being overwhelmed by the beauty of services in Constantinople's Hagia Sophia. Reality was likely more prosaic, involving political calculations about which alliance would prove most advantageous. In 988, Vladimir was baptized, married a Byzantine princess, and ordered the mass baptism of his subjects, beginning in Kiev, where the populace was driven into the Dnieper River to receive the sacrament. The conversion of Kievan Rus proceeded rapidly in cities and more slowly in rural areas where pagan practices persisted for centuries alongside nominal Christianity. Vladimir destroyed pagan temples and idols, including the great statue of Perun that stood in Kiev, casting it into the Dnieper in symbolic rejection of the old faith. Byzantine clergy arrived to establish churches and train native priests, though the language of the church was not Greek, but Old Church Slavonic, the literary language created by Cyril and Methodius that was comprehensible to the Eastern Slavs with minimal adaptation. The Christianization of Kievan Rus brought profound changes to Eastern Slavic society. Literacy spread as churches needed priests capable of reading scripture and liturgy. Byzantine art and architecture found new expression in Slavic lands, with stone churches built on Byzantine models adorned with frescoes and icons in the Byzantine style, yet increasingly incorporating local elements. Byzantine law codes were translated and adapted, providing new frameworks for justice and social organization. Monasteries were established, becoming centers of learning, artistic production, and spiritual life. The cultural gap between Kievan Rus and Western Europe, already substantial due to distance and different historical trajectories, was reinforced by religious alignment, as the Rus looked to Constantinople rather than Rome for guidance and inspiration. By the early 11th century, the major Slavic peoples had embarked on paths that would define their cultures for a millennium. The South Slavs in the Balkans had embraced Christianity in both its Byzantine and Roman forms, with Bulgarian and Serbian territories following Constantinople, while Croatian and Slovenian lands acknowledged Rome. The West Slavs of Poland and Bohemia had accepted Roman Christianity and looked westward for cultural models. The East Slavs of Kievan Rus had committed to Byzantine Christianity and begun developing a distinct cultural synthesis. All had acquired written languages and the literacy that made possible the recording of history, the codification of law, and the preservation of learning. The tribal societies of the migration period had evolved into nascent kingdoms and principalities, still crude by Byzantine or Western European standards, but unmistakably moving toward greater complexity and sophistication. The long process of state formation had begun, a process that would continue through centuries of conflict, consolidation, and transformation. The 11th and 12th centuries witnessed the flowering of medieval Slavic civilization as the states born in the previous era matured into kingdoms with distinct identities, as dynasties consolidated their power, as culture and learning reached heights that seemed impossible just generations earlier. Yet this golden age was neither uniform across Slavic lands nor free from violence and upheaval. Each region followed its own trajectory, shaped by geography, by the ambitions of rulers, by relationships with powerful neighbors, and by internal dynamics that sometimes fostered unity and sometimes tore societies apart. Kievan Rus reached its zenith under Yaroslav the Wise, who ruled from 1019 to 1054. Yaroslav inherited a realm still consolidating from the conversion to Christianity, still defining itself against both internal, tribal particularism and external threats. He proved himself worthy of his epithet through both military prowess and cultural achievement. In warfare, he defended Rus against Pecheneg nomads from the steppe, achieving a decisive victory in 1036 that essentially ended their threat. He also conducted campaigns against Poland, Byzantium, and various Baltic tribes, expanding and securing his borders while demonstrating that Kievan Rus could hold its own against any neighbor. Yet Yaroslav's greatest achievements lay in the realm of culture and statecraft. He established the first written law code in Rus, the Russkaya Pravda, which codified legal principles and provided a framework for justice that blended Slavic custom with Byzantine law. He promoted literacy and learning, founding schools and encouraging the translation of Greek texts into Slavonic. Under his patronage, Kiev became a city of churches, the most magnificent being the Cathedral of St. Sophia. Built in conscious imitation of Constantinople's great church, its golden domes visible for miles across the flat landscape of the Dnieper Valley. The city grew into a major urban center, perhaps home to 50,000 people, a metropolis by the standards of 11th century Eastern Europe. Yaroslav also understood the value of dynastic marriages in cementing alliances and raising the prestige of his realm. He himself married the daughter of the Swedish king, linking Kievan Rus to Scandinavia. His children married into the royal houses of France, Hungary, Norway, Poland, and Byzantium, a testament to the status Kievan Rus had achieved in just a few decades since its conversion. When a French queen wrote home describing the magnificence of Kiev, Western Europeans began to recognize that civilization had taken root in the forests of the East, that the Rus were no longer merely barbarous raiders but a Christian kingdom worthy of respect. Yet the very success of Kievan Rus contained seeds of future problems. Yaroslav's system of succession, intended to prevent fratricidal conflict by establishing a complex rotation of princes through various cities based on seniority, instead created endless disputes and warfare among his descendants. The unity of Kievan Rus, always more theoretical than actual given the vast distances and poor communications, fragmented as powerful princes in Novgorod, Chernigov, Smolensk and other cities pursued their own interests. The Grand Prince in Kiev retained symbolic primacy but decreasing practical authority. By the 12th century, Kievan Rus had become a loose confederation of principalities united by language, religion, and nominal recognition of a single dynasty, but incapable of coordinated action. To the west, Poland emerged as the first significant state among the West Slavs, unified under the Piast dynasty. Duke Mieszko I, ruling in the mid-10th century, made the momentous decision to accept Christianity from Rome rather than Constantinople, a choice that aligned Poland with Western rather than Eastern Christendom. His son Bolesław the Brave, one of the most remarkable Slavic rulers of the medieval period, transformed the duchy into a kingdom, receiving a royal crown in 1025, shortly before his death. Bolesław expanded Polish territory in all directions, briefly even capturing Kiev, and established Poland as a major power in Central Europe. The consolidation of the Polish state proceeded through both conquest and assimilation, as the Piast rulers subdued neighboring Slavic tribes and incorporated them into an increasingly centralized realm. The introduction of Christianity brought Latin literacy, Roman ecclesiastical organization, and connections to the broader European world. Polish bishops reported to the Pope rather than to the Patriarch of Constantinople. Polish law developed along Western rather than Byzantine lines, and Polish culture absorbed influences from Germany, Italy, and France, while retaining distinctly Slavic characteristics. The foundation of the Archbishopric of Gniezno in 1000 established Polish ecclesiastical independence, preventing the Church in Poland from becoming a mere extension of German dioceses. Yet Poland faced constant challenges from German expansion eastward. The Holy Roman Empire, centered in Germany, viewed the Slavic lands to the east as legitimate targets for both political domination and religious conversion, even though many of these lands had already accepted Christianity. The military orders, particularly the Teutonic Knights, established themselves along the Baltic coast and pushed aggressively against Polish and other Slavic territories. This pressure from the west would remain a constant feature of Polish history, shaping political calculations and fostering a sense of embattlement that reinforced Polish identity even as it strained Polish resources. South of Poland, in the lands that would become the Czech Republic, Bohemia developed as another significant West Slavic state. The Przemyslid dynasty, legendary descendants of a ploughman chosen to be prince, ruled from their capital in Prague, which grew into a major city adorned with Romanesque churches and stone fortifications. Bohemia's location at the heart of Central Europe, surrounded by German territories, created a different dynamic than Poland experienced. The Bohemian princes found themselves drawn into the orbit of the Holy Roman Empire, sometimes voluntarily seeking its protection, sometimes compelled by force to acknowledge German suzerainty. Yet Bohemia retained considerable autonomy and developed a sophisticated culture that blended Slavic and German elements. The cult of Saint Wenceslaus, a 10th century prince murdered by his brother but venerated as a martyr and patron saint of Bohemia, provided a focus for Czech identity and religious devotion. Prague attracted scholars, craftsmen, and merchants from across Europe, its markets busy with trade, its churches filled with worshippers, its court a center of learning and artistic patronage. The Bohemian princes walked a tightrope between independence and subordination, maintaining Slavic language and culture while accommodating German influence and power. In the Balkans, the collapse of the First Bulgarian Empire under Byzantine pressure in the early 11th century temporarily set back South Slavic state formation, but the vacuum did not last. Serbia emerged as a significant power under the Nemanjić dynasty, which established control over Serbian territories in the late 12th century. The Serbs, who had converted to Orthodox Christianity through Byzantine influence, developed a culture that synthesized Byzantine religious and artistic traditions with indigenous Slavic elements. Serbian monasteries, built in remote mountain valleys, became repositories of learning and artistic achievement, their frescoes ranking among the finest examples of medieval art. Croatia, on the Adriatic coast, followed a different path due to its geographic position and political circumstances. Croatian rulers accepted Roman Catholicism and looked westward to Italy and to the Frankish and later Holy Roman Empire for models and alliances. The Croatian kingdom achieved considerable power in the 10th and 11th centuries, controlling much of the Dalmatian coast and islands, but its independence proved fragile. In 1102, Croatia entered into a personal union with Hungary, the Hungarian king also becoming King of Croatia, a relationship that preserved Croatian autonomy to a degree but subordinated Croatian interests to Hungarian ambitions. The division between Catholic and Orthodox Christianity, formalized in the Great Schism of 1054, created lasting divisions among the Slavic peoples. West Slavs and some South Slavs followed Rome, using the Latin alphabet and Latin liturgy, looking to the Pope for spiritual authority, and absorbing cultural influences from Western Europe. East Slavs and most South Slavs followed Constantinople, using Cyrillic script and Slavonic liturgy, looking to the Patriarch for guidance and developing under Byzantine cultural influence. These religious differences, seemingly minor points of theology and practice, acquired immense political and cultural significance, creating barriers to unity that would persist for 1,000 years. Trade networks crisscrossed the Slavic world, connecting diverse regions and facilitating exchange of goods, ideas, and cultural practices. The great river routes of Eastern Europe, particularly the Dnieper and Volga, carried commerce between north and south, Scandinavian traders and Rus merchants meeting Byzantine and Arab buyers in markets along the way. Overland routes connected Poland and Bohemia to German cities and to the Mediterranean through Italian merchants. The Hanseatic League, that great commercial confederation of northern European cities, established trading posts in Slavic territories, particularly in Novgorod, which became a wealthy city republic through its participation in Baltic commerce. The economic base of Slavic societies remained overwhelmingly agricultural, with the vast majority of the population consisting of peasants working the land. Yet the nature of agriculture varied considerably by region and changed over time. The old slash and burn technique gave way in many areas to more intensive farming using crop rotation and manuring. Three field systems, which allowed more efficient use of arable land, spread gradually from the west. Plows improved, becoming heavier and more effective at breaking up soil. Mills, both water-powered and wind-powered, appeared to grind grain, their construction indicating accumulation of capital and development of specialized craftsmen. Social stratification increased as Slavic societies grew more complex. The old tribal equality, where free warriors might gather in assemblies to make decisions, gave way to hierarchical systems with princes at the top, followed by nobles and warriors, then urban artisans and merchants, and finally the mass of peasants who provided the labor that sustained everyone else. Slavery, common in the early medieval period, gradually declined as economic changes made enslaved peasants more valuable than slaves, but the difference between a slave and a serf, bound to the land, remained subtle. The Church provided the only real avenue for social mobility, as talented individuals from humble backgrounds could rise through ecclesiastical ranks to positions of influence and authority. Warfare remained endemic, a constant feature of life that shaped social structures and economic priorities. Princes fought each other for territory and prestige, led raids against neighbors for plunder and glory, defended their lands against nomadic incursions from the steppe. The druzhina, those professional warriors who formed the military corps of Slavic states, lived for battle, their entire identity wrapped up in martial prowess and loyalty to their prince. Chronicles recounted their deeds in loving detail, battles described with attention to individual acts of heroism, princes praised or condemned based on their performance in war. Peace, when it came, seemed merely an interlude between conflicts, a time to rest and prepare for the next campaign. Yet alongside this violence flourished culture of remarkable sophistication. Monasteries produced illuminated manuscripts, their pages decorated with intricate designs and vivid illustrations. Icon painters created images of saints and biblical scenes that combined Byzantine techniques with local sensibilities. Architects designed churches that adapted Byzantine or Romanesque styles to local materials and conditions, creating distinctive regional variations. Epic poetry celebrated heroic deeds, preserving oral traditions in written form for future generations. Legal codes attempted to bring order to society, prescribing punishments for crimes and procedures for resolving disputes. The literary culture that emerged in Kievan Rus deserves particular mention for its richness and sophistication. The primary chronicle, compiled in the early 12th century, provided not merely a record of events, but a providential interpretation of history, seeing the hand of God in the rise and fall of princes. Saints' lives, translated from Greek or composed locally, offered models of Christian virtue and miraculous intervention in human affairs. Sermons demonstrated rhetorical skill and theological understanding, instructing the faithful in proper belief and conduct. Even secular works appeared, such as the Instruction of Vladimir Monomach, in which that prince offered advice to his sons on how to rule justly and live righteously. By the middle of the 12th century, the Slavic peoples had established themselves as permanent features of the European landscape, no longer primitive tribes emerging from obscurity, but Christian kingdoms and principalities with their own cultural achievements and political aspirations. They had survived the chaos of the migration period, built states from tribal foundations, adopted Christianity and literacy, and created cultures that blended indigenous traditions with influences from Byzantium and Western Europe. Yet the height of medieval Slavic civilization coincided with the approach of catastrophes that would test every achievement, disasters that would destroy some Slavic states entirely and transform others beyond recognition. The comfortable assumption that progress was inevitable, that civilization once established would continue to advance, would soon be shattered by invasions from the east that would reshape the entire Slavic world. The 13th century brought devastation to the Slavic world on a scale that contemporaries struggled to comprehend, a catastrophe that arrived from the east with such speed and ferocity that even regions far from the initial impact felt its effects for generations. The Mongol invasion, launched by the heirs of Genghis Khan, shattered the political order of Eastern Europe, destroyed cities that had taken centuries to build, and fundamentally altered the trajectory of Slavic history. The world that emerged from this trauma differed profoundly from the one that existed before, as some regions fell under direct Mongol rule, others adapted to new geopolitical realities, and all struggled to make sense of a disaster that seemed to herald the end of civilization itself. The Mongols appeared on the horizon of the Rus lands in 1223, when a scouting force defeated a coalition of Rus princes at the Battle of the Kalka River. This initial encounter, though bloody, seemed at the time like just another raid from the steppe, the kind of nomadic incursion that Rus had weathered many times before. The Mongol force withdrew after the battle, and life continued with little sense of the approaching doom. But this had been merely reconnaissance, a probing of defences before the main assault. When the Mongols returned in 1237 under Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis, they came not to raid, but to conquer, with an army of perhaps 150,000 warriors supported by siege engines and Chinese engineers, organized with a discipline and efficiency that no European force could match. The invasion began in winter, a season when frozen rivers became highways for cavalry, and when defenders expected safety behind snow and ice. The Mongols swept through the Principality of Ryazan, their siege engines reducing its fortified cities to rubble in days rather than the months such sieges normally required. The Prince of Ryazan and his family were killed, the population slaughtered or enslaved, and the Mongols moved on to the next target, barely pausing to rest. Vladimir, one of the greatest cities of northeastern Rus, fell in February 1238 after a siege of only 5 days. The wooden buildings burned, the stone churches cracked and collapsed under bombardment, and the Grand Prince perished along with his family in a cathedral where they had sought sanctuary. City after city suffered the same fate as the Mongol army, divided into multiple columns, each operating independently, yet in coordination, converging on targets from unexpected directions, moving with a speed that seemed impossible. Suzdal, Rostov, Yaroslavl, Tver, all the great cities of northeastern Rus fell within months. A relief force attempting to confront the invaders was annihilated at the Battle of the Sit River in March 1238, the Grand Prince killed along with most of his army. Only the spring thaw, which turned the land to impassable mud, saved the city of Novgorod from assault. The Mongols withdrew to the steppe to rest their horses and prepare for the next phase of conquest. In 1240, the Mongols returned to complete the subjugation of Rus. They struck southward into the heartland, into the territory around Kiev that had been the center of Rus civilization for 3 centuries. Kiev itself, though much diminished from its former glory due to decades of internecine warfare among Rus princes, remained a symbol of Rus unity and Orthodox Christianity, its churches and monasteries repositories of learning and art. The city resisted for months, its defenders fighting with desperate courage, but Mongol siege engines methodically destroyed its fortifications. When Kiev finally fell in December 1240, the Mongols sacked it thoroughly, destroying most of its buildings and killing or enslaving much of its population. The great cathedral of St. Sophia, built by Yaroslav the Wise 2 centuries earlier, survived but stood amid ruins as a monument to vanished glory. The Mongol conquest did not stop at the borders of Rus, but continued westward into Poland and Hungary, demonstrating that no European power could resist their advance. A coalition of Polish and German knights met the Mongols at the Battle of Legnica in April 1241, only to be crushed despite fighting bravely. The Mongols reached the Adriatic Sea before withdrawing, not because they had been defeated, but because news arrived of the death of the great Khan Ogedei in distant Mongolia, requiring the princes to return east to participate in choosing his successor. Europe had been saved not by military prowess, but by chance and the internal politics of a distant empire. The territories of Kievan Rus fell under Mongol domination, incorporated into the western portion of the Mongol Empire known as the Golden Horde. The nature of this domination differed from traditional conquest and occupation. The Mongols did not directly administer most Rus territories, did not impose their religion or culture, did not station large garrisons in every city. Instead, they established a system of indirect rule, allowing Rus princes to continue governing their principalities, provided they acknowledged Mongol overlordship, paid tribute, and supplied troops when demanded. Princes had to travel to the Mongol capital to receive patents of authority, a humiliating submission that nonetheless preserved a degree of local autonomy. This system of Mongol rule, sometimes called the Tatar yoke, lasted for more than 2 centuries and profoundly influenced the development of Rus society and politics. The regular payment of tribute drained wealth that might otherwise have been invested in churches, learning, or economic development. The periodic Mongol punitive expeditions, launched whenever princes rebelled or failed to pay tribute, prevented recovery and kept populations in a state of fear. The destruction of Kiev and other major cities shifted the center of gravity in Rus northward and eastward to cities like Vladimir, Tver, and especially Moscow, that had been relatively minor before the invasion, but grew in importance under Mongol rule. Yet the Mongol domination also had paradoxical effects that would shape the future. The unified Mongol administration, despite its foreign nature, provided a framework within which Rus principalities existed. Princes learned from Mongol administrative techniques, adopted aspects of Mongol taxation systems, and absorbed ideas about centralized authority that would prove useful when building their own states. The Orthodox Church, exempt from Mongol taxation and persecution, actually flourished during this period, becoming the primary institution maintaining Rus cultural identity. And competition among princes for Mongol favor, though often bloody and morally compromising, eventually resulted in the rise of Moscow as the dominant principality, laying foundations for future Russian unity. While the Eastern Slavs struggled under Mongol rule, the Western Slavs faced different but equally serious challenges. Poland, though devastated by the Mongol raids of 1241, had not been incorporated into the Golden Horde. Yet the kingdom fragmented in the 13th century into competing duchies as the Piast dynasty split into multiple lines, each ruling portions of what had been a unified realm. This fragmentation left Poland vulnerable to expansion by neighbors, particularly the Teutonic Knights, who conquered pagan Prussia and established a militaristic state along the Baltic that constantly threatened Polish territories. The Teutonic Knights, originally founded to fight in the Holy Land, had been invited to Poland to help convert and subdue pagan Prussian tribes. They succeeded in this mission with brutal efficiency, but then turned their order into an independent state that pursued its own interests at Polish expense. The Knights expanded aggressively, conquering territories that Poland claimed, establishing German settlements in conquered lands, and building massive brick fortresses that demonstrated their intention to remain permanently. The castle at Marienburg, the order's headquarters, symbolized Teutonic power, a structure so vast and strong that it seemed to mock Polish pretensions to control the region. Yet Poland was not destroyed by these pressures but tempered by them. The necessity of resistance to external threats fostered Polish identity, even as political fragmentation prevented effective defense. The eventual reunification of Poland under Władysław the Elbow High in the early 14th century, followed by the reign of his son Casimir the Great, restored Polish power and even expanded it. Casimir proved himself one of the great medieval Slavic rulers, reforming law, founding universities, building fortifications, and increasing Polish territory eastward into regions inhabited by Ukrainians and Belarusians. His epithet, the Great, acknowledged achievements that made Poland a major power despite the disasters of the previous century. In the Balkans, yet another pattern unfolded, shaped by different circumstances and actors. The Byzantine Empire, which had dominated the region for centuries, entered terminal decline in the 13th century, creating opportunities for Slavic states to expand into the vacuum. Serbia, under the Nemanjić dynasty, grew from a relatively small principality into a major Balkan power. Stefan Dušan, who ruled from 1331 to 1355, transformed Serbia into an empire that dominated much of the Balkans, conquering territories from weakened Byzantium and proclaiming himself emperor of the Serbs and Greeks. Dušan's Serbian Empire represented the high point of medieval South Slavic power, a realm that stretched from the Danube to central Greece, encompassing diverse populations and ancient cities. Dušan issued a comprehensive law code that blended Serbian customs with Byzantine law, established a Serbian patriarchate independent of Constantinople, and patronized a cultural flowering that produced magnificent churches, monasteries adorned with frescoes, and a literature that celebrated Serbian achievements. The empire seemed poised to replace Byzantium as the dominant power in the Balkans, a Slavic successor to the Roman and Byzantine traditions. Yet Serbian power proved fragile, dependent on the personality and military success of a single ruler. When Dušan died suddenly in 1355, probably of plague, his empire fragmented immediately. His successors could not maintain unity as nobles carved out independent domains, Byzantine territories broke away, and external enemies sensed opportunity. The moment of Serbian greatness passed almost as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind cultural achievements and bitter memories of what might have been. The disunity among Balkan Slavs, their inability to coordinate against common threats, would soon prove catastrophic as a new power emerged on the scene. The Ottoman Turks, originally a relatively minor Turkish tribe in Anatolia, had built an empire through remarkable military prowess and administrative sophistication. By the mid-14th century, they had crossed into Europe, establishing footholds in the Balkans and beginning the conquest that would eventually bring most of the region under their control. The Ottomans advanced methodically, defeating Byzantine, Bulgarian, and Serbian forces in a series of battles, each victory bringing more territory under their rule. Their success owed much to superior military organization, particularly their elite infantry corps, the Janissaries, and to their policy of offering favorable terms to those who submitted voluntarily while devastating those who resisted. The Battle of Kosovo in 1389 became the defining moment in Serbian historical memory, a defeat that acquired legendary status far beyond its immediate military significance. Prince Lazar led a Serbian army, possibly supported by contingents from other Balkan peoples, against the Ottoman Sultan Murad. The battle, fought on Kosovo Field on June 15th, was fierce and bloody, resulting in the deaths of both Lazar and Murad, but ending in Serbian defeat. Though Serbia survived as a vassal state for a few more decades, Kosovo marked the effective end of Serbian independence. The battle entered Serbian epic poetry as a moment of tragic heroism, the last stand of Christian knights against the infidel, a defeat somehow transformed into moral victory through the nobility of the sacrifice. The Ottoman conquest of the Balkans proceeded over the following decades and into the 15th century, gradually incorporating Serbian, Bulgarian, and eventually Byzantine territories. Constantinople itself fell in 1453, ending the 1,000-year history of the Byzantine Empire and completing Ottoman dominance of the Eastern Mediterranean and Balkans. The South Slavs found themselves subjects of an Islamic empire ruled by a sultan in Constantinople rather than by Slavic princes or Orthodox emperors. This would remain the fundamental fact of South Slavic existence for the next 4 to 5 centuries, profoundly shaping their societies, cultures, and historical trajectories. The late medieval period thus saw the Slavic world divided among multiple spheres of influence and domination. The Eastern Slavs lived under Mongol overlordship, their lands periodically ravaged, their princes competing for favor from foreign rulers, yet slowly building the foundations for future independence. The Western Slavs maintained their independence, but faced constant pressure from German expansion and internal political fragmentation. The Southern Slavs fell increasingly under Ottoman control, their brief moment of empire building crushed, their future determined by distant rulers following alien religious and cultural traditions. The unity that language and some cultural elements provided seemed irrelevant in the face of these political divisions, these separate fates that drove the various Slavic peoples onto divergent paths from which they would not fully reconverge. The 14th and 15th centuries witnessed the emergence of new political configurations among the Slavic peoples, as some recovered from earlier disasters while others adapted to circumstances that seemed permanent. The period saw the creation of one of the largest states in European history, the rise of a principality from obscurity to dominance in the East, religious conflicts that tore at the fabric of societies, and the slow consolidation of patterns that would define Slavic history for centuries. It was an age of both opportunity and constraint, where skilled rulers could achieve remarkable things, but where the weight of geography, tradition, and powerful neighbors limited what even the most ambitious could accomplish. Poland emerged from its period of fragmentation to become the core of a vast commonwealth that would dominate Eastern Europe for centuries. The key to this transformation was dynastic union with Lithuania, a grand duchy that had expanded across territories of modern Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine. Lithuania remained pagan longer than any other European state, its rulers resisting Christianity while building an empire through conquest of weakened Rus principalities. The Lithuanian Grand Dukes proved remarkably capable at warfare and statecraft, creating a realm that stretched from the Baltic almost to the Black Sea, incorporating diverse populations who spoke different languages and followed different faiths. The union of Poland and Lithuania began with the marriage of the Lithuanian Grand Duke Jogaila to the Polish Queen Jadwiga in 1386, a political arrangement that brought enormous consequences. Jogaila, who took the baptized name Władysław, converted to Christianity along with his pagan subjects, bringing the last great pagan nation of Europe into the Catholic fold. The union created, at least in theory, a single political entity from the Baltic to the Black Sea, though in practice Poland and Lithuania maintained separate administrations, laws and interests for many decades. The Jagiellon dynasty, as the descendants of Jogaila came to be called, would rule this commonwealth and at various times also control Bohemia and Hungary, making them among the most powerful rulers in Europe. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, as it eventually became formalized, developed a unique political system that blended monarchical, aristocratic, and even quasi-democratic elements. The nobility, numerous in Poland compared to Western European kingdoms, possessed extensive rights and privileges that limited royal authority. The principle that the king ruled with the consent of the nobility became fundamental, expressed in the maxim that nothing concerning all should be decided without the approval of all. This would eventually evolve into the liberum veto, where a single nobleman could block legislation in the Sejm or parliament, a principle that seemed to embody political freedom but would prove catastrophic when it prevented necessary reforms. The greatest military achievement of the Polish-Lithuanian Union came at the Battle of Grunwald in 1410, where a combined Polish-Lithuanian army crushed the Teutonic Knights. The battle, one of the largest medieval engagements in Europe, involved perhaps 60,000 combatants. The Teutonic Knights, who had seemed invincible in their fortresses, were decisively defeated, their Grand Master killed, along with much of the Order's leadership. Though the Knights survived as an entity and even retained control of their territories in the immediate aftermath, their power had been broken. They would never again threaten Poland as they once had, and the victory at Grunwald became a defining moment in Polish national memory, proof that Slavic forces could defeat German military orders. The territories controlled by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth became a zone of religious and ethnic diversity unprecedented in medieval Europe. Catholics predominated in Poland proper, Orthodox Christians in Lithuania, and the former Rus territories, Jews in substantial numbers in cities and towns, and smaller populations of Muslims, Protestants after the Reformation, and various other groups. This diversity created both richness and tension, opportunities for cultural exchange, and potential for conflict. The Polish nobility generally practiced religious tolerance, at least by the standards of the time, recognizing that attempts to enforce religious uniformity would be both impractical and destabilizing in such a diverse realm. While Poland and Lithuania constructed their commonwealth in the West, a very different process unfolded among the Eastern Slavs still under Mongol domination. Moscow, a city barely mentioned in chronicles before the Mongol invasion, gradually emerged as the most important principality in northeastern Rus. Its rise owed much to the policies of its princes, who proved particularly skilled at navigating the dangerous waters of Mongol politics. The Muscovite princes cultivated relationships with the Mongol Khans, collected tribute on behalf of the Golden Horde, and used their position as intermediaries to strengthen their own power at the expense of rival principalities. Ivan Fouthes, who ruled Moscow from 1325 to 1340, exemplified the pragmatic approach that built Muscovite power. Nicknamed Kalita, or moneybags, for his reputed wealth, Ivan collaborated closely with the Mongols, crushing rebellions in other cities on behalf of the Khan and using the chaos to expand Moscow's territory. he persuaded the metropolitan of the Orthodox Church to move his seat from Vladimir to Moscow, giving the city spiritual primacy alongside political importance. Ivan's methods were often ruthless and morally questionable by the standards of later Russian historians seeking heroic ancestors, but they were effective. Moscow grew rich while rivals declined, accumulated territories while others fragmented, and positioned itself for eventual dominance. The expansion of Muscovite power accelerated under Ivan III, called Ivan the Great, who ruled from 1462 to 1505. Ivan transformed Moscow from a large principality into the nucleus of what would become the Russian state. He conquered or absorbed the other major Rus principalities, including the wealthy Republic of Novgorod in 1478, ending its tradition of self-government and incorporating its vast northern territories. He married Sophia Palaiologina, niece of the last Byzantine emperor, a union that allowed Moscow to claim succession to Byzantine imperial traditions after Constantinople's fall to the Ottomans. And most significantly, he threw off Mongol overlordship in 1480, refusing to pay tribute and successfully facing down a Mongol army without battle in a confrontation known as the Great Stand on the Ugra River. Ivan the Great's reign marked the emergence of Muscovy as an independent state with imperial pretensions. He adopted the Byzantine double-headed eagle as his emblem, claimed the title of autocrat, and began to articulate the idea that Moscow was the third Rome, successor to Rome and Constantinople, as the center of true Christianity. This ideology would profoundly influence Russian political culture, fostering beliefs in Moscow's special destiny, in the sacred character of Russian autocracy, and in Russia's role as defender of orthodoxy against both Catholic West and Muslim East. The practical implications were equally significant, as Ivan created administrative structures, legal codes, and military organizations that would form the basis of the Russian state. The early 16th century brought another transformative figure to the Muscovite throne, Ivan IV, known to history as Ivan the Terrible. The epithet terrible translates the Russian Grozny, which might better be rendered as awe-inspiring or formidable, though Ivan's reign certainly earned him a reputation for terror as well. Crowned as Tsar in 1547, the first Muscovite ruler to formally adopt this title derived from the Roman Caesar, Ivan embarked on campaigns of conquest that expanded Russia enormously. He conquered the Tatar Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan, successor states to the Golden Horde, opening the way for Russian expansion into Siberia and Central Asia. He reformed the military, administration, and law, attempted to strengthen central authority, and patronized learning and the arts. Yet Ivan's reign also descended into paranoia and violence that traumatized Russian society. In 1565, he established the Oprichnina, a state within a state, governed directly by him through a special force of Oprichniki who dressed in black and terrorized the population. The Oprichnina targeted the nobility, whom Ivan suspected of treason, confiscating their estates and executing thousands. The city of Novgorod, suspected of planning to defect to Poland-Lithuania, suffered a massacre in 1570 that killed perhaps thousands of inhabitants. Ivan, in a fit of rage, killed his own son and heir, an act that helped precipitate the dynastic crisis that followed his death. The terrible Tsar left Russia expanded and stronger in some ways, but also deeply wounded, its society traumatized by arbitrary violence from above. The death of Ivan's other son, the feeble-minded Fyodor, in 1598 ended the Rurikid dynasty that had ruled Rus since legendary times. The period that followed, known as the Time of Troubles, plunged Russia into chaos for 15 years. Pretenders claiming to be Ivan's miraculously survived son, Dmitry, appeared, backed by Polish-Lithuanian forces. Boyar families competed for power, some inviting foreign intervention to support their claims. Peasant rebellions erupted as social order collapsed. Polish armies occupied Moscow for a time, and Sweden seized territories in the northwest. Russia seemed on the verge of complete disintegration, perhaps to be partitioned among its neighbors or to fragment into warring principalities as it had before the Mongol invasion. Salvation came from an unlikely source, a popular movement led by a merchant named Kuzma Minin and a prince named Dmitry Pozharsky, who rallied forces to expel the Polish garrison from Moscow in 1612. The following year, a Zemsky Sobor, or Assembly of the Land, elected a new Tsar, 16-year-old Michael Romanov, whose family would rule Russia until 1917. The early Romanovs devoted themselves to rebuilding a country devastated by years of warfare and internal strife. They restored central authority, reorganized the military, expanded the bureaucracy, and cautiously resumed territorial expansion. Russia recovered slowly but steadily, its survival a testament to the resilience of the Russian people and the strength of institutions that had been built over previous centuries. Beyond the struggles of states and dynasties, the religious life of Slavic peoples underwent significant developments during these centuries. The Catholic-Orthodox divide that had existed since the Great Schism deepened as theological and political differences reinforced each other. The Catholic Church, having weathered challenges from various heretical movements, faced a much greater crisis with the Protestant Reformation that began in 1517 when Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses. The Reformation split Western Christianity, with much of Northern Europe adopting various forms of Protestantism, while Southern Europe remained Catholic. The Slavic lands felt the impact of these religious upheavals in complex ways. Bohemia experienced religious conflict particularly intensely, having been the site of an earlier proto-Protestant movement led by Jan Hus in the early 15th century. Hus, a priest and scholar influenced by the English reformer John Wycliffe, had criticized corruption in the Catholic Church and called for reforms. He was burned at the stake as a heretic in 1415, but his followers, the Hussites, fought a series of wars against Catholic crusaders and maintained control of Bohemia for decades. The Hussite Wars demonstrated that popular religious movements could resist imperial and papal power, a lesson not lost on later reformers. When the Protestant Reformation began, Bohemia became a religiously diverse region where Catholics, various Protestant denominations, and remnants of the Hussite tradition coexisted uneasily. Poland, despite being Catholic, developed a reputation for religious tolerance in the 16th century, particularly after the Warsaw Confederation of 1573 formally guaranteed religious freedom to the nobility. The Commonwealth became a refuge for religious minorities fleeing persecution elsewhere, including Protestants from Germany, Orthodox from Ottoman territories, and Jews from across Europe. This tolerance had practical motivations, recognition that attempting to enforce religious unity in such a diverse state would be both impossible and destructive. Yet it also reflected genuine intellectual currents of the Renaissance reaching Poland, ideas about human dignity and freedom of conscience that challenged medieval assumptions about the necessity of religious uniformity. In Ukrainian territories contested between Poland, Lithuania, and Muscovy, a unique social and military phenomenon emerged in the form of the Cossacks. These were groups of armed men, often runaway serfs or adventurers, who established themselves in the borderlands beyond effective governmental control. The Cossacks organized themselves into self-governing military communities, electing their leaders called hetmans, raiding Ottoman territories for plunder, and serving as irregular cavalry for Poland or Russia when it suited their interests. The most important Cossack host, the Zaporozhian Sich, established itself beyond the Dnieper rapids in territory that was theoretically Polish but effectively autonomous. The Cossacks became symbols of freedom and martial prowess in Ukrainian culture, celebrated in epic poetry and folk songs as defenders of Christianity against Muslim Ottomans and Tatars. Their relationship with Poland remained ambiguous, as they valued their autonomy but needed Polish support against larger enemies. Cossack rebellions against Poland in the 17th century would have profound consequences. eventually leading parts of Ukraine to seek Russian protection. But in the 16th century they remained one more element in the complex mosaic of Eastern European politics and society. The Cossacks embodied in many ways the frontier spirit of the Slavic borderlands, regions where state authority remained weak, where social mobility through martial prowess was possible, and where old traditions of warrior democracy survived longer than in more settled areas. By 1600, the Slavic world existed in multiple configurations, shaped by centuries of divergent development. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth stood at its zenith, a vast realm that seemed to embody Slavic power and cultural achievement. Muscovite Russia, having thrown off the Mongol yoke and survived the time of troubles, was rebuilding under a new dynasty. The South Slavs remained under Ottoman rule, their distinct identities maintained, but their political independence lost. The West Slavs found themselves caught between German and Polish spheres of influence. Religious divisions between Catholic and Orthodox, and increasingly involving Protestants as well, created lines of conflict that sometimes aligned with, and sometimes cut across, ethnic and linguistic boundaries. The medieval world of Slavic kingdoms and principalities had given way to early modern configurations that would shape the next centuries of Slavic history. The 17th and 18th centuries witnessed the transformation of the Slavic world through the expansion of imperial power, as three great empires extended their control over Slavic populations and reshaped the political map of Eastern Europe. The Habsburg Empire, centered in Austria, consolidated control over the Western Slavs and expanded into territories taken from the Ottoman Empire. The Russian Empire, under rulers determined to modernize and westernize, grew into a continental power that stretched from Poland to the Pacific. The Ottoman Empire, though beginning its long decline, maintained dominion over millions of South Slavs. These imperial structures determined the fate of Slavic peoples for 2 centuries, imposing administrative systems, economic policies, and cultural influences that sometimes complemented and sometimes conflicted with indigenous traditions. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which had seemed so powerful in the 16th century, entered a period of crisis from which it would never fully recover. The Commonwealth's political system, which had evolved to protect noble privileges and limit royal authority, increasingly paralyzed decision-making just when strong leadership was needed to address mounting challenges. The liberum veto, by which any single deputy could dissolve the Sejm and nullify all legislation passed during that session, became a tool for foreign powers to block reforms by bribing individual nobles to exercise their veto. The nobility's obsession with their golden freedom, their refusal to submit to centralized authority or maintain a standing army, left the Commonwealth militarily weak even as it faced aggressive neighbors on all sides. The mid-17th century brought disasters that exposed the Commonwealth's weaknesses. The Khmelnytsky uprising, which began in 1648, saw Ukrainian Cossacks revolt against Polish rule, massacring Polish nobles and Jews in territories they controlled and eventually seeking Russian protection. The uprising evolved into a long war that devastated Ukrainian territories and resulted in the Treaty of Pereyaslav in 1654, by which the Zaporozhian Cossacks placed themselves under Russian sovereignty. This agreement, whether understood as full incorporation into Russia or merely a military alliance, would be invoked by Russian rulers for centuries as justification for their control over Ukrainian territories. The Russo-Polish War that followed the Khmelnytsky uprising, combined with Swedish invasion from the north and Tatar raids from the south, brought the Commonwealth to the brink of collapse in what Poles remember as the Deluge. Cities were sacked, populations slaughtered or enslaved, entire regions depopulated. The royal treasury was exhausted, the economy shattered, and social order nearly dissolved. The Commonwealth survived, but barely, and emerged from these wars permanently weakened. The territories east of the Dnieper, agreed to Russia in the Treaty of Andrusovo in 1667, were lost forever, the first of many territorial losses that would eventually erase the Commonwealth from the map. As Poland declined, Russia ascended under rulers who combined ruthless ambition with willingness to adopt Western ideas and technologies. Peter the Great, who ruled from 1682 to 1725, stands as one of the most consequential figures in Russian and Slavic history. Peter recognized that Russia lagged behind Western Europe in military technology, administrative efficiency, and cultural development, and he determined to close this gap regardless of the cost. He traveled incognito through Western Europe, working in shipyards and visiting factories, observing and learning. He returned determined to modernize Russia by force if necessary, dragging his reluctant subjects into what he viewed as the modern world. Peter's reforms touched every aspect of Russian life. He created a professional standing army and navy modeled on Western European forces, drilling soldiers in Western tactics and equipping them with Western weapons. He reformed the administrative system, creating colleges or ministries on the Swedish model to replace the chaotic system of competing departments. He compelled nobles to serve the state, either in military or civil capacities, ending their traditional freedom to remain on their estates. He required nobles to adopt Western dress, famously cutting the beards of courtiers who appeared before him in traditional Russian fashion. He founded a new capital, St. Petersburg, built on marshland at the mouth of the Neva River, designed by European architects to be a window on the west, rather than looking eastward, as Moscow did. The cost of Peter's modernization was enormous in human terms. Tens of thousands died building St. Petersburg, working in conditions that amounted to slavery. The burden of taxation to support Peter's wars and reforms crushed the peasantry, who were increasingly enserfed, bound to the land and subject to the arbitrary authority of noble landowners. The traditional partnership between Tsar and Orthodox Church was ended as Peter subordinated the Church to state control, abolishing the Patriarchate and replacing it with a Holy Synod staffed by officials who were essentially civil servants. Many Russians, particularly among the old believers who had rejected liturgical reforms of the previous century, viewed Peter as the Antichrist, destroyer of Holy Rus and its traditions. Yet Peter achieved his fundamental goals. Russia defeated Sweden in the Great Northern War, gaining territory on the Baltic coast and establishing itself as a major European power. The army and navy Peter created made Russia a military force that could compete with any European state. The administrative reforms, however imperfectly implemented, provided structures that would govern Russia into the 20th century. St. Petersburg became a magnificent city, its palaces and cathedrals testimony to Russian cultural achievement. Russia had become, by the time of Peter's death, undeniably European in ways it had not been before, though at what cost to its own traditions remained a question Russians would debate for centuries. Peter's successors, particularly Catherine the Great, who ruled from 1762 to 1796, continued his policies of expansion and westernization while adding their own emphases. Catherine, a German princess who had married the Russian heir and then overthrown him in a coup, proved to be one of the most successful rulers in Russian history. She corresponded with Voltaire and other Enlightenment philosophers, presenting herself as an enlightened despot who ruled rationally for the benefit of her subjects. The reality was more complex, as Catherine's reign saw the consolidation of serfdom at precisely the time when Enlightenment thought questioned the morality of such bondage. Catherine's foreign policy brought enormous territorial gains. 2 wars against the Ottoman Empire secured the northern coast of the Black Sea and established Russia as protector of Orthodox Christians in Ottoman territories. The partitions of Poland, carried out in cooperation with Prussia and Austria in 1772, 1793 and 1795, erased the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth from the map and brought millions of Poles, Lithuanians and other subjects under Russian rule. Catherine thus united under Russian sovereignty most of the territories of Kievan Rus, fulfilling what Russian nationalists saw as the gathering of Russian lands, but what Poles, Ukrainians, and others experienced as imperial conquest. The destruction of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth ranks among the great crimes of 18th-century European diplomacy. The deliberate extinction of a large state by its neighbours who cynically calculated that partition served their interests better than allowing the Commonwealth to continue existing even in weakened form. Polish patriots attempted reforms in the dying years of the Commonwealth, particularly the Constitution of 1791, which sought to create a more effective government, but these efforts came too late and were blocked by Russian military intervention. The final partition in 1795 divided the last remnants of Polish territory among Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Poland ceased to exist as an independent state, beginning a 123-year period of partition during which Polish national identity survived without corresponding political entity. The Habsburg Empire, though it had not expanded as dramatically as Russia, consolidated control over substantial Slavic populations in Central Europe and the Balkans. The Habsburgs ruled Czechs and Slovaks in Bohemia and Moravia, Croats and Slovenes in territories taken from the Ottoman Empire or inherited through dynastic marriages, and Poles in Galicia acquired through the partition. The Habsburg approach to governing this diverse empire differed from Russian methods, relying more on administrative efficiency and less on naked force, though compulsion remained ever present when other methods failed. The Habsburgs promoted Catholicism, supported German language and culture as unifying elements, and granted limited autonomy to various ethnic groups while maintaining firm central control over military and foreign policy. Yet Habsburg territories became sites of increasing tension between the dynasty's universalist aspirations and the growing national consciousness of subject peoples. The Czech lands, though economically developed and culturally sophisticated, were ruled from Vienna by German-speaking officials who viewed Czech language and culture as peasant traditions without political significance. Croats maintained their own assembly and some autonomy, but chafed at rule from Budapest after the Compromise of 1867 united Austria and Hungary, while leaving Croatia subordinate to the Hungarian half of the dual monarchy. The Slavs of the Habsburg Empire began to develop national movements that would eventually challenge the empire's very existence. The South Slavs under Ottoman rule experienced different circumstances. The Ottoman system, though it subordinated Christians to Muslims and extracted heavy taxation, allowed considerable local autonomy and did not attempt to suppress Orthodox Christianity or Slavic languages. The institution of the millet system, which organized subjects by religious affiliation rather than ethnicity, meant that Orthodox Slavs maintained their religious hierarchy, their churches, and their sense of identity even under foreign rule. Yet Ottoman decline in the 17th and 18th centuries brought increasing disorder, as central authority weakened and local governors ruled with increasing arbitrariness. Banditry became endemic, taxation unpredictable, and justice uncertain. Some South Slavs collaborated with Ottoman rule, converting to Islam to gain advantages in the system. Bosnia in particular saw substantial conversions, creating a Muslim Slavic population that added another layer of complexity to Balkan ethno-religious divisions. These conversions were often pragmatic rather than deeply spiritual, undertaken to avoid taxation or gain access to positions of authority, but they created lasting divisions. Serbs who maintained Orthodox Christianity often viewed Muslim Slavs as traitors to their people, even though linguistically and ethnically they remained closely related. These religious divisions would poison Balkan politics into the 20th century. The 18th century also witnessed the first stirrings of the national awakenings that would transform the Slavic world in the following century. The concept of the nation, in the modern sense of a people united by language and culture, who deserved political self-determination, was developing through Enlightenment thought and the example of the American and French revolutions. Slavic intellectuals exposed to these ideas through education in Western Europe began to think of their peoples not as subjects of empires or members of religious communities, but as nations with their own rights and destinies. This remained primarily an intellectual phenomenon in the 18th century, confined to small circles of educated individuals, but it planted seeds that would flower dramatically. The linguistic revival became a key aspect of these early national movements. Scholars began to study Slavic languages scientifically, compile dictionaries and grammars, collect folk poetry and songs, and argue for the value of vernacular languages against claims that only Latin, German, or Russian had sufficient sophistication for literature and learning. Czech scholars particularly pioneered this linguistic nationalism, working to demonstrate that Czech was capable of expressing complex ideas and worthy of use in education, government, and culture. Similar movements developed among other Slavic peoples, each seeking to establish the dignity and viability of their language as part of broader claims to national existence. Pan-Slavism, the idea that all Slavic peoples shared fundamental kinship and should cooperate or even unite politically, emerged as another strain of nationalist thought. Russian Slavophiles, reacting against Peter the Great's westernization, argued that Slavic civilization possessed unique virtues that Western Europe lacked, particularly a spirit of community and organic social bonds contrasted with Western individualism and rationalism. They envisioned Russia leading a federation or alliance of Slavic peoples, though whether this would be a partnership of equals or Russian domination remained ambiguous. Other Slavs viewed Pan-Slavism with suspicion, recognizing that it often served as justification for Russian imperial ambitions, even as it appealed to genuine feelings of cultural kinship. By 1800, the Slavic world existed under imperial domination, with no Slavic state except the ambiguous case of Russia enjoying genuine independence. The Austrian, Russian, and Ottoman empires controlled the destinies of Poles, Czechs, Ukrainians, Serbs, Croats, Bulgarians, and other Slavic peoples. Yet beneath this surface of imperial order, forces were building that would challenge and eventually destroy these empires. National consciousness was awakening, fed by romantic nationalism that celebrated folk culture and historical grievances. Social and economic changes were creating new classes, particularly bourgeoisie and industrial workers, who did not fit neatly into traditional imperial structures, and the great empires themselves, though they seemed powerful, rested on foundations weakened by the contradictions between autocratic governance and modernizing economies, between multinational populations and centralizing administrative systems. The 19th century would bring these contradictions to crisis, transforming the Slavic world yet again through revolution, warfare, and the eventual creation of new nation-states from the ruins of fallen empires. The 19th century dawned with Europe convulsed by the aftermath of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, upheavals that would profoundly affect the Slavic world. Napoleon's conquests temporarily reordered the map of Europe, raising hopes among subject peoples that the old imperial order might be overthrown and replaced with something more just. For Poles in particular, Napoleon seemed a potential liberator. The creation of the Duchy of Warsaw from territories seized from Prussia offered a glimpse of renewed Polish statehood, and Polish legions fought in Napoleon's armies across Europe, their soldiers singing that Poland is not yet lost while we still live. Yet Napoleon's defeat in 1815 dashed these hopes as the Congress of Vienna restored a conservative order based on monarchical legitimacy and great power equilibrium. The post-Napoleonic settlement confirmed and even strengthened the partition of Poland among Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Russian Poland became a Congress kingdom with some autonomy, but this proved temporary and illusory. The other Slavic peoples remained subordinate within their respective empires, their languages dismissed as peasant dialects, their cultures treated as quaint folklore rather than serious civilizational achievements, their political aspirations ignored by rulers convinced that multinational empires governed by enlightened monarchs represented the highest form of political organization. Yet the revolutionary ideals unleashed by France could not be entirely suppressed, and throughout the 19th century they fermented beneath the surface of apparent imperial stability. The first major challenge to this order came in 1830 when Polish patriots rose in rebellion against Russian rule, the November Uprising, that began when Polish military cadets seized the Warsaw Arsenal. The rebels established a provisional government and fought Russian forces for nearly a year before being crushed by overwhelming military superiority. The aftermath was brutal, as Tsar Nicholas I, the archetypal reactionary monarch, eliminated Polish autonomy, closed Polish universities, imposed Russian as the administrative language, and exiled thousands of Poles to Siberia. The Catholic Church in Poland, seen as a center of resistance, faced severe restrictions. Russian officials openly spoke of eliminating Polish identity entirely, Russifying the population through force. Another Polish rebellion in 1863, the January Uprising, followed a similar pattern of heroic resistance and ultimate defeat. This time, the rebellion spread to Lithuanian and Belarusian territories, reflecting not just Polish nationalism, but broader discontent with Russian rule. Peasants participated more actively than in earlier uprisings, responding to promises of land reform from rebel leaders. Yet the military outcome remained the same, Russian forces methodically suppressing the rebellion over the course of 18 months. The repression that followed was even harsher than after 1830, with mass executions, deportations to Siberia, confiscation of estates, and systematic efforts to eliminate all traces of Polish institutions in areas under Russian control. The Polish uprisings, though failures militarily, had significant consequences for Slavic history. They demonstrated that national consciousness, once awakened, could not be easily suppressed despite overwhelming force and repression. They inspired other subject peoples to consider their own struggles for liberation. They created a Polish diaspora, émigrés scattered across Western Europe and America, who kept Polish culture alive and lobbied for international support. And they forced a reorientation of Polish nationalism away from armed rebellion toward cultural resistance and organic work, building up national strength through education, economic development, and preservation of language and traditions while waiting for more favorable circumstances for political action. The wave of revolutions that swept Europe in 1848 brought upheaval to Slavic lands as well, though with complex and sometimes contradictory results. In the Habsburg Empire, Czech patriots in Prague organized a Pan-Slav Congress that brought together representatives of various Slavic peoples to discuss common interests and possible cooperation. The Congress represented a high point of Pan-Slavic sentiment, the hope that Slavic peoples might unite to achieve what none could accomplish alone. Yet the revolution in the Habsburg lands was crushed, and the empire entered a period of neo-absolutism that suppressed all national movements and attempted to Germanize subject peoples. The 1848 revolutions revealed deep tensions among Slavic peoples themselves, not just between Slavs and imperial authorities. In Hungary, where Magyars sought independence from Austrian rule, Croatian and Serbian populations sided with Vienna against Hungarian nationalists who threatened to impose Magyarization on Slavic minorities. This created lasting bitterness, as Hungarians viewed Slavs as traitors to the revolutionary cause, while Slavs saw Hungarians as oppressors who would be worse than Austrians. Such divisions, where Slavic peoples found themselves on opposite sides of conflicts due to different imperial allegiances or competing national programs, would repeatedly complicate efforts at Slavic unity. In Russia, the 1848 revolutions reinforced Nicholas I's reactionary policies, as he viewed any hint of liberalism or nationalism as dangerous contagion from the West. Russia became the gendarme of Europe, its armies crushing revolutionary movements in neighboring states. Yet this conservatism could not prevent social and economic changes that were transforming Russian society. The emancipation of the serfs in 1861, enacted by Alexander II after Russia's defeat in the Crimean War, demonstrated the empire's backwardness, theoretically, freed millions of peasants from bondage. In practice, the terms of emancipation left peasants impoverished and bitter, forced to make redemption payments for land that had traditionally been theirs, tied to village communes that controlled their movements and often worse off economically than before emancipation. The liberation of the serfs marked a watershed in Russian and Slavic history nonetheless, the recognition that modernization required free labor and that the traditional social order based on bondage had become untenable. It unleashed forces that would ultimately destroy the imperial system as freed peasants migrated to cities, industrial development accelerated, new social classes emerged, and expectations rose among populations no longer willing to accept their traditional place in the social hierarchy. The gap between the pace of social change and the rigidity of political structures created tensions that would eventually explode in revolution. The late 19th century witnessed significant shifts in the situation of South Slavs under Ottoman rule. The Balkan peoples, inspired by Greek independence achieved in the 1820s and encouraged by Russian support, began to throw off Ottoman domination. Serbia achieved effective autonomy following uprisings in the early 19th century and became fully independent after the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-1878. Romania, though not Slavic, provided an example of successful nation-building from Ottoman provinces. Bulgaria, after centuries of Ottoman rule, was re-established as an autonomous principality and later kingdom, its liberation celebrated as a triumph of Slavic solidarity and Russian patronage. The emergence of independent Balkan states created new dynamics in the region, not all positive. The new states, while celebrating their freedom from Ottoman rule, immediately fell into conflicts over territory, each claiming lands inhabited by mixed populations and drawing borders that left substantial minorities on the wrong side. The decline of Ottoman power created a vacuum that the great powers sought to fill, with Russia supporting Orthodox Slavs, Austria-Hungary opposing any strengthening of Slavic states that might encourage its own Slavic subjects to seek independence, and various Western powers pursuing their own interests. The Balkans became a powder keg where local conflicts might trigger great power confrontation. The Congress of Berlin in 1878, which settled the Balkans after the Russo-Turkish War, exemplified the great powers treating Slavic peoples as pawns in their geopolitical games. Russia, which had done most of the fighting and expected to dominate the settlement, found its gains limited by British and Austrian pressure. Bulgaria was divided. Bosnia-Herzegovina was occupied by Austria-Hungary despite its South Slavic population, and Serbian ambitions were constrained. The Russians felt betrayed by their Western allies, while the Balkan peoples felt cheated of territories they viewed as rightfully theirs. The settlement satisfied no one and contained seeds of future conflicts. Austria-Hungary's occupation and later annexation of Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1908 proved particularly inflammatory. Bosnia contained mixed populations of Orthodox Serbs, Catholic Croats, and Muslim Bosniaks. But Serbian nationalists viewed it as Serbian land that should be part of a greater Serbian state. The Young Bosnia movement, inspired by romantic nationalism and revolutionary ideologies, began organizing against Austrian rule, staging assassinations and terrorist attacks. The Habsburg authorities responded with repression, which only fed the revolutionary fervor. The stage was being set for an assassination that would trigger the catastrophe of World War I. The Industrial Revolution, arriving later to Eastern Europe than to the West, but transforming societies nonetheless, created new social forces that challenged imperial structures. Cities grew rapidly as peasants fled the countryside seeking industrial employment. Warsaw, Prague, Kiev, and other cities became manufacturing centers with all the attendant social problems of rapid urbanization, overcrowding, poor sanitation, exploitation of labor, and stark inequality. An industrial working class emerged, concentrated in factories, increasingly literate and politically conscious, receptive to socialist and anarchist ideologies that promised liberation from both capitalist exploitation and imperial oppression. The rise of socialist movements among Slavic peoples added another dimension to national struggles. Some socialists argued that class struggle transcended national boundaries, that workers of all ethnicities should unite against capitalist and imperial oppressors, regardless of language or culture. Others, called National Socialists, though without the later Nazi connotations, believed that national liberation and social revolution were inseparable, that workers could not be free while their nations remained enslaved. These debates created splits within socialist movements and complicated relationships between socialism and nationalism, alliances and conflicts that would shape 20th-century Slavic history. The Russian Empire in particular became a hotbed of revolutionary activity in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Multiple currents competed for influence: liberal reformers who wanted a constitutional monarchy, populists who idealized the peasantry and sought agrarian socialism, Marxists who emphasized the industrial proletariat, anarchists who rejected all hierarchical authority, and nationalist movements among non-Russian peoples seeking independence or autonomy. The assassination of Alexander II in 1881 by revolutionary terrorists, after he had enacted various reforms, led to renewed repression under his successors. Yet repression could not stop the revolutionary tide, only drive it underground where it became more radical and violent. The revolution of 1905, triggered by the disastrous Russo-Japanese War, demonstrated the fragility of the Russian Empire. Strikes paralyzed cities, peasants seized noble estates, mutinies broke out in the military, including the famous rebellion on the battleship Potemkin, and nationalist movements erupted across the empire's non-Russian territories. Nicholas II was forced to issue the October Manifesto, promising a constitutional government and civil liberties. The establishment of the Duma, an elected legislature, seemed to herald transformation of autocracy into constitutional monarchy. Yet the Tsar and his advisors worked to minimize the Duma's power, and by 1907 the revolutionary moment had passed. The empire apparently stabilized through a combination of limited reforms and renewed repression. The period between 1905 and 1914 was one of rapid change across Slavic lands. Economic growth accelerated, particularly in Russia, which experienced remarkable industrial expansion. Cultural life flourished, with Slavic writers, composers, artists, and scientists achieving international recognition. Political parties organized and competed for influence, even in authoritarian environments. Mass education spread literacy, newspapers reached broader audiences, and new technologies like railroads and telegraphs connected regions that had been isolated. There was a sense, particularly among the educated classes, that progress was inevitable, that the 20th century would bring solutions to the problems that had plagued the 19th. Yet beneath this optimism lay profound contradictions and mounting tension. The gap between rich and poor widened as capitalism developed. National minorities chafed under imperial rule and discrimination. Workers and peasants demanded better conditions and political rights. The great powers competed for influence, building alliances and planning for wars that seemed increasingly likely. The Balkans seethed with irredentist movements and ethnic hatreds, and across Slavic lands revolutionary movements prepared for the moment when the old order would finally collapse, convinced that history was on their side and that their particular vision of the future would triumph. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, by a Serbian nationalist provided the spark that ignited the powder keg. Austria-Hungary, determined to crush Serbian nationalism, issued an ultimatum designed to be unacceptable. Russia, seeing itself as protector of Slavic peoples and unwilling to allow Austria-Hungary to dominate the Balkans, mobilized its forces. Germany, allied with Austria-Hungary, declared war on Russia. France, allied with Russia, entered the conflict. Britain joined its allies. Within weeks, Europe was at war, a conflict that contemporaries expected to be brief, but which would drag on for 4 years, kill millions, destroy empires, and reshape the Slavic world beyond anything revolutionaries had imagined possible. The First World War proved catastrophic for the Slavic world, destroying 3 of the empires that had dominated Slavic peoples for centuries and creating conditions for revolutionary transformations that contemporaries could scarcely have imagined. The conflict pitted Slavic peoples against each other in ways that revealed the hollowness of pan-Slavic solidarity. Russians fought Austrians and Germans, but also the Poles and Ukrainians who served in Habsburg armies. Serbs battled Croats and Slovenes who wore Austro-Hungarian uniforms. Czechs were conscripted to fight for an empire many of them despised. The war demonstrated that imperial allegiances and political circumstances trumped ethnic and linguistic kinship when nations mobilized for total war. The Eastern Front, stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, became a theater of enormous armies and devastating battles. Russian forces initially advanced into East Prussia and Galicia, but German and Austrian counter-offensives drove them back with terrible losses. The war in the East was more mobile than the static trench warfare of the Western Front, but no less brutal. Millions died in battles whose names are remembered primarily by specialists. Entire regions were devastated as armies advanced and retreated, requisitioning food, destroying infrastructure, and displacing populations. The strain on all combatants was immense, but Russia, with its inefficient economy and corrupt administration, suffered disproportionately. By 1917, the Russian Empire was collapsing under the weight of military defeats, economic breakdown, and social unrest. Food shortages plagued cities, inflation destroyed savings, casualties mounted into the millions, and faith in the government evaporated. In March, strikes and demonstrations in Petrograd escalated into revolution as troops refused to fire on protesters. Nicholas II abdicated, ending 3 centuries of Romanov rule. A provisional government attempted to continue the war while implementing reforms, but it lacked legitimacy and effective power. Across the empire, soldiers deserted, peasants seized land, workers occupied factories, and non-Russian peoples declared autonomy or independence. The Bolshevik seizure of power in November 1917, though carried out in Petrograd and Moscow by relatively small groups of revolutionaries, had profound consequences for all Slavic peoples. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, promised peace, land, and bread, a program that appealed to war-weary soldiers, land-hungry peasants, and starving urban workers. They immediately sued for peace with Germany, signing the humiliating Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918 that surrendered vast territories including Ukraine, the Baltic states, and Poland. Yet the Bolsheviks calculated that survival of their revolution mattered more than territorial integrity, and that revolutionary upheavals in Germany and other countries would soon overturn the treaty anyway. The civil war that engulfed Russia from 1918 to 1921 was one of the most destructive conflicts in history, claiming millions of lives through combat, famine, disease, and terror. The Red Army, created by Leon Trotsky and imbued with revolutionary ideology, fought white armies that sought to restore some version of the old order, nationalist movements that sought independence for non-Russian peoples, and various other factions pursuing their own agendas. Foreign intervention by Allied powers, including British, French, American, and Japanese forces, complicated the conflict without decisively influencing its outcome. The Bolsheviks prevailed through superior organization, control of the industrial heartland, and ruthless terror against opponents. The establishment of the Soviet Union in 1922, formerly the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, created a new kind of state that claimed to transcend national differences through socialist ideology. In theory, the Soviet Union was a federation of equal republics organized along ethnic lines. In practice, it was ruled from Moscow by the Communist Party, which maintained tight control over all aspects of life through a combination of ideology, bureaucracy, and secret police terror. The Bolsheviks, having promised self-determination to non-Russian peoples, instead reconquered most of the former Russian Empire and imposed communist rule, arguing that bourgeois nationalism was reactionary while socialist internationalism represented the true interests of all workers. The collapse of Austria-Hungary in the final months of World War I created opportunities for Slavic peoples who had been subjects of that empire. Czechoslovakia declared independence on October 28, 1918, uniting Czech lands and Slovakia under a democratic government led by Tomáš Masaryk, a philosopher and longtime advocate of Czech independence. The new state faced challenges integrating Czechs and Slovaks who had different historical experiences, as well as governing substantial German and Hungarian minorities who resented being placed under Slavic rule. Yet, Czechoslovakia established itself as the most successful democracy in Eastern Europe, with a functioning parliamentary system, respect for civil liberties, and a relatively prosperous economy. The creation of Yugoslavia, the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, as it was initially called, represented an attempt to unite the South Slavs in a single state. Serbia, having suffered enormously during the war but emerged on the winning side, provided the nucleus and the ruling dynasty. Croatia, Slovenia, and other territories formerly part of Austria-Hungary were incorporated. Yet Yugoslavia was troubled from the start by tensions between Serbs who dominated the government and military and other peoples who resented Serbian hegemony. Croats in particular chafed at centralized rule from Belgrade, advocating for federalism that would grant autonomy to constituent peoples. These tensions would plague Yugoslavia throughout its existence. Poland regained independence after 123 years of partition, reconstituted from territories taken from all three empires that had divided it. The resurrection of the Polish state fulfilled dreams that had sustained Polish nationalism through the long night of partition, yet the new Poland faced enormous challenges. Its borders were uncertain, contested with every neighbor. Its economy was devastated by years of warfare. Its population was ethnically diverse, with substantial Ukrainian, Belarusian, Jewish, and German minorities who did not necessarily identify with Polish nationalism. And the new state immediately found itself at war with Soviet Russia, fighting for territories in Ukraine and Belarus that both claimed. The Polish-Soviet War of 1919-1921 was a conflict of existential importance for both sides. For Poland, defeat would mean absorption into the Soviet Union and the end of renewed independence. For Soviet Russia, victory promised the spread of revolution westward to Germany and beyond, potentially igniting world revolution. The war seesawed back and forth, with Polish forces initially advancing deep into Ukraine, then Red Army counteroffensives driving to the gates of Warsaw. The decisive Battle of Warsaw in August 1920, called the Miracle on the Vistula by Poles, saw Polish forces under Józef Piłsudski defeat the Red Army, saving Poland and possibly preventing the spread of communism to Central Europe. The interwar period, the 2 decades between world wars, was a time of both hope and mounting crisis for the newly independent Slavic states. Czechoslovakia maintained its democracy and experienced economic growth, becoming an industrial power that seemed to validate the possibility of liberal politics in Eastern Europe. Poland struggled with economic problems and political instability, ultimately succumbing to authoritarian rule under Piłsudski after his coup in 1926, though remaining far less oppressive than the totalitarian regimes emerging elsewhere. Yugoslavia lurched between parliamentary politics and royal dictatorship, never resolving the fundamental tension between unitarism and federalism. The Soviet Union under Stalin underwent forced industrialization and collectivization of agriculture that transformed society at enormous human cost. Stalin's first 5-year plan, launched in 1928, aimed to convert a backward agrarian country into an industrial power within a decade. Millions of peasants were driven from the land into new industrial cities, forced to work in factories under harsh conditions. Collectivization of agriculture, which aimed to eliminate private farming and concentrate peasants in state-controlled collective farms, met fierce resistance, particularly in Ukraine, where peasants slaughtered livestock rather than surrender them. The resulting famine of 1932-1933, known as the Holodomor, killed millions of Ukrainians in what many scholars consider genocide. The Great Terror of 1936-1938 saw Stalin purge the Communist Party, the military and society at large of alleged enemies. Millions were arrested on fabricated charges of counter-revolutionary activity, sabotage, or espionage. Show trials forced prominent Bolsheviks to confess to absurd conspiracies. Executions and deportations to the Gulag labor camp system claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. The terror created an atmosphere of paranoia where anyone might be denounced by neighbors, co-workers, or even family members. Soviet citizens learned to keep their heads down, to express no independent thoughts, to parrot official ideology while trusting no one. The revolution that had promised liberation created a tyranny more absolute than anything the Tsars had achieved. Yet the Soviet Union also achieved genuine accomplishments during this period that must be acknowledged alongside the horrors. Literacy campaigns eliminated illiteracy within a generation. Women gained legal equality and access to education and careers previously closed to them. Industrialization created a modern economy capable of producing steel, machinery, chemicals, and armaments. Scientific research advanced in multiple fields. The Soviet Union became a great power, its military rebuilt after the disasters of World War I and the Civil War. These achievements came at a terrible price, but they were real, and they help explain why many Soviet citizens, even those who suffered under Stalin's rule, maintained some loyalty to the system. The 1930s also witnessed the rise of fascism and Nazism, ideologies that viewed Slavs as racially inferior and targeted them for conquest and enslavement. Hitler's Nazi Germany, which came to power in 1933, explicitly advocated Lebensraum, living space for Germans to be carved from Slavic lands to the east. Nazi ideology classified Slavs as Untermenschen, subhumans fit only for labor under German masters. Hitler's plans, detailed in Mein Kampf and various speeches, envisioned the destruction of Poland and Russia, the colonization of their territories by Germans, and the reduction of surviving Slavs to Helot status. These were not idle threats, but serious programs that Nazi Germany would attempt to implement once it had the power. The Munich Agreement of 1938, by which Britain and France allowed Hitler to dismember Czechoslovakia, demonstrated Western willingness to sacrifice Slavic states to appease Nazi Germany. Czechoslovakia, the most democratic and prosperous Slavic state, was abandoned by its supposed allies and forced to surrender the Sudetenland with its ethnic German population to Germany. Within months, Hitler occupied the remainder of Czech lands, creating the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, while Slovakia became a nominally independent puppet state. The destruction of Czechoslovakia removed the last barrier to German expansion eastward and convinced Stalin that the Western powers could not be trusted to resist Hitler. The Nazi-Soviet Pact of August 1939 stunned the world, as the two ideological enemies agreed to divide Eastern Europe between them. Secret protocols assigned Poland, the Baltic states, and parts of Romania to respective Soviet and German spheres of influence. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland from the west. On September 17th, the Soviet Union invaded from the east. Poland, attacked from both sides, collapsed within weeks despite fierce resistance. The second partition of Poland, this time by totalitarian powers even more ruthless than the monarchies that had divided Poland in the 18th century, seemed to end Polish independence permanently. The 2 years between the Nazi-Soviet Pact and Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 were a dark time for Slavic peoples. Poland disappeared from the map, its territories divided between German and Soviet occupation, both implementing programs of terror designed to destroy the Polish nation. The Nazis executed Polish intellectuals, clergy and political leaders, closed schools and universities, and treated Poles as slave labor. The Soviets deported hundreds of thousands to Siberia and Kazakhstan, executed Polish officers in the Katyn Forest massacre, and attempted to Sovietize their occupation zone. Ordinary Poles found themselves crushed between two totalitarian systems, both determined to eliminate Polish culture and identity. The German invasion of the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa, began the bloodiest conflict in human history. 3 million German and Axis troops attacked along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Soviet forces, weakened by Stalin's purges and caught by surprise despite numerous warnings, initially collapsed. German armies advanced hundreds of miles in weeks, encircling and destroying entire Soviet armies, capturing millions of prisoners. By December, German forces had reached the outskirts of Moscow, Leningrad was under siege, and much of Ukraine was occupied. The Soviet Union seemed on the verge of destruction, exactly as Hitler had planned. Yet the Soviets did not collapse. Stalin, having initially panicked, recovered and rallied the country to what was called the Great Patriotic War. Soviet industry, much of it evacuated eastward beyond the Urals, continued to produce tanks, aircraft, and munitions. The Red Army, despite catastrophic losses, found commanders who learned to fight effectively. The population, subjected to brutal German occupation policies that made Soviet rule seem venerable by comparison, supported resistance rather than welcoming Germans as liberators, as Hitler had expected, and Soviet allies, particularly the United States and Britain, provided crucial material support through the Lend-Lease program. The tide began to turn with the German defeat at Stalingrad in the winter of 1942-1943, one of the most brutal battles in history that claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. The German Sixth Army, which had fought its way into the city, was surrounded and forced to surrender. The battle demonstrated that the Wehrmacht could be defeated, that German military superiority had limits. The following summer, the Battle of Kursk saw the last major German offensive on the Eastern Front fail decisively. From that point forward, Soviet forces advanced westward, slowly at first but with increasing momentum, driving German armies back through Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, and eventually into Germany itself. The cost of the war for Slavic peoples defies comprehension. The Soviet Union lost perhaps 27 million people, military and civilian combined, though exact numbers remain uncertain. Poland lost 6 million, nearly 20% of its pre-war population, including 3 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust. Yugoslavia lost over 1 million in combat, massacres, and famines. Entire cities were reduced to rubble. Villages were burned, populations were displaced, deported, or annihilated. The Nazis implemented programs of deliberate starvation, mass shootings, and industrial murder that aimed at the destruction of Slavic peoples, particularly Jews, and the educated classes whose elimination would leave leaderless masses suitable for enslavement. The Holocaust, while claiming Jewish victims above all, also targeted Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, Polish intellectuals, and others whom Nazi ideology deemed unworthy of life. The victory over Nazi Germany in May 1945 came at a cost so enormous that it shaped everything that followed. The Soviet Union emerged as a great power, its armies occupying Eastern Europe, its prestige enhanced by having borne the main burden of defeating Hitler. Yet Soviet society was traumatized, its population depleted, its western territories devastated. The other Slavic peoples found themselves either within the Soviet Union or occupied by Soviet forces, their futures to be determined by Stalin's decisions about how to organize the post-war world. The wartime alliance with the United States and Britain dissolved rapidly into Cold War confrontation, and the question of how Slavic nations would develop whether toward the Soviet model or some alternative, would dominate the next half-century of their history. The post-war world that emerged from the ruins of 1945 divided Europe and the Slavic peoples along ideological lines that would persist for nearly half a century. The Iron Curtain, as Winston Churchill memorably described it, descended across the continent from the Baltic to the Adriatic, separating communist Eastern Europe from capitalist Western Europe. Nearly all Slavic peoples found themselves on the eastern side of this divide, either within the Soviet Union itself or in satellite states where communist parties ruled under Soviet supervision. The exceptions were Yugoslavia, which charted its own path under Josip Broz Tito, and small Slavic minorities in Western countries. The Cold War transformed the Slavic world into a testing ground for competing visions of modernity, a region where the promise of socialist utopia confronted the reality of authoritarian control. Stalin moved quickly to consolidate Soviet control over Eastern Europe. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and eventually East Germany fell under communist rule through a combination of Soviet military presence, manipulation of elections, intimidation of opposition parties, and outright coups. Native communists, many of whom had spent the war years in Moscow, returned to take power with Soviet backing. Coalition governments that initially included non-communist parties were systematically transformed into single-party dictatorships modeled on the Soviet system. By 1948, the Sovietization of Eastern Europe was largely complete, with each country adopting constitutions, economic systems, and political structures that mirrored those of the USSR. Poland provides a particularly poignant example of post-war transformation. Having fought on the Allied side throughout the war, having never surrendered, having contributed significantly to Allied victory through its armed forces in exile and resistance at home, Poland found itself nonetheless delivered into the Soviet sphere. The borders were redrawn, with Poland losing territories in the east to the Soviet Union and gaining German territories in the west, a massive population transfer that saw millions of Germans expelled and Poles resettled. The communist government imposed with Soviet backing initially enjoyed little popular support, but maintained power through control of the military, security services, and all institutions of importance. Polish society, traumatized by war and wary of Soviet power, largely acquiesced to the new reality, even as many harbored hopes that Western powers might somehow reverse the outcome. Czechoslovakia's descent into communism was particularly tragic, given its democratic tradition. The communists came to power through a coup in February 1948, overthrowing a government that still maintained some democratic features. Jan Masaryk, the foreign minister and son of the founder of Czechoslovakia, died in mysterious circumstances that were officially called suicide but widely believed to be murder. The coup shocked Western observers who had hoped Czechoslovakia might bridge East and West, but Stalin was determined that no ambiguity would remain about Soviet control. The Prague Spring would have to wait 2 decades, and even then it would be crushed. Yugoslavia under Tito charted a unique course that demonstrated the possibility of communist rule independent of Soviet domination. Tito, whose partisan forces had liberated Yugoslavia largely without Soviet assistance, refused to subordinate Yugoslav interests to Moscow's demands. In 1948, Stalin expelled Yugoslavia from the Cominform, the organization coordinating communist parties, expecting Tito to fall quickly. Instead, Yugoslavia survived, developing its own brand of socialism that included worker self-management, greater openness to the West, and a foreign policy of non-alignment that sought to position Yugoslavia as a leader of nations refusing to choose sides in the Cold War. Tito's success in defying Stalin inspired others, but also convinced Soviet leaders that satellites must be controlled more tightly to prevent additional defections. Life behind the Iron Curtain settled into patterns that would persist for decades. Communist parties maintained monopolies on power, tolerating no organized opposition and treating dissent as criminal or psychiatric disorder. Secret police organizations, descendants of the Soviet NKVD, monitored populations through networks of informants who reported suspicious conversations, activities, or attitudes. State ownership of industry eliminated private enterprise and subjected economic life to central planning that prioritized heavy industry and military production over consumer goods. Living standards remained well below those of Western Europe, though the communist states provided basic security through guaranteed employment, subsidized housing, free education and healthcare, and other social benefits that made poverty less desperate than in earlier eras. The death of Stalin in 1953 brought limited relaxation of the most extreme forms of repression. Nikita Khrushchev's secret speech denouncing Stalin's crimes at the 20th Party Congress in 1956 shocked the communist world and encouraged hopes for reform. Yet these hopes were quickly dashed when popular uprisings in Poland and Hungary were met with force. The Hungarian Revolution of 1956 saw a spontaneous popular uprising against communist rule that briefly seemed successful, as the government collapsed and Soviet troops initially withdrew. Yet within weeks, Soviet forces returned in overwhelming strength, crushing the revolution with tanks and artillery. Thousands were killed, hundreds of thousands fled as refugees, and the leaders of the uprising were executed. The message was clear: reform would be permitted only within limits acceptable to Moscow. The 1960s brought renewed hopes for liberalization, particularly in Czechoslovakia, where Alexander Dubček's government attempted to create socialism with a human face during the Prague Spring of 1968. Censorship was relaxed, political prisoners were released, and discussion flourished about democratic reforms while maintaining the socialist system. For a few months, it seemed possible that a communist state might evolve toward genuine democracy. Yet, Soviet leaders, fearing that Czechoslovak reforms might inspire similar movements elsewhere, invaded with Warsaw Pact forces in August 1968. The invasion, though not as bloody as the Hungarian intervention, ended the Prague Spring and inaugurated a period of normalization that meant return to rigid orthodoxy. Dubček was removed from power, reformers were purged, and Czechoslovakia entered 2 decades of stagnation under a regime that had lost all legitimacy but maintained power through Soviet backing. Poland proved the most resistant of the Soviet satellites, repeatedly challenging communist orthodoxy through workers' strikes, intellectual dissent, and Catholic Church opposition. The election of a Polish pope, Karol Wojtyła, becoming John Paul II in 1978, provided enormous moral authority to opposition forces. His visit to Poland in 1979 attracted millions who demonstrated that the nation remained Catholic and nationalist despite decades of communist rule. When workers at the Lenin shipyard in Gdansk struck in August 1980 demanding independent trade unions and other reforms, the movement spread across Poland with stunning speed. Solidarity, the independent trade union led by electrician Lech Wałęsa, gained 10 million members within months, becoming the first independent workers' organization in the communist bloc. The communist authorities, unable to crush Solidarity through normal means and unwilling to request Soviet intervention that might trigger civil war, resorted to martial law in December 1981. General Wojciech Jaruzelski declared military rule, arrested Solidarity leaders, and banned the union. Yet martial law could not eliminate the social forces Solidarity represented, and after several years the regime was forced to negotiate. Solidarity survived underground, supported by the church and by Western assistance, waiting for the moment when the communist system would weaken enough for it to re-emerge. That moment came in the late 1980s as the Soviet Union itself began to transform under Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev, recognizing that the Soviet system was failing economically and losing the Cold War technologically, attempted reforms through policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. Yet these reforms, intended to save communism by making it more efficient and humane, instead unleashed forces that would destroy the system. Once censorship relaxed, criticism of the regime poured forth. Once political monopoly loosened, opposition movements organized openly. And crucially, Gorbachev made clear that Soviet forces would not intervene to prop up communist governments in Eastern Europe, reversing decades of policy. The fall of communism in 1989 occurred with breathtaking speed, a domino effect as one regime after another collapsed. Poland led the way with round-table negotiations between Solidarity and the communist government in early 1989, resulting in partially free elections in June that gave Solidarity a landslide victory. Hungary opened its border with Austria, allowing East Germans to escape westward and triggering a refugee crisis that destabilized the German Democratic Republic. Mass demonstrations in East Germany forced the opening of the Berlin Wall on November 9th, that most symbolic moment when the division of Europe seemed to end. Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution saw massive peaceful protests force the communist government to resign. Romania experienced violence as the dictator Nicolae Ceausescu was overthrown and executed. By the end of 1989, communist rule had ended across Eastern Europe, swept away not primarily by external pressure, but by internal rejection of systems that had lost all legitimacy. The peaceful dissolution of the Soviet Union itself between 1989 and 1991 was equally remarkable. The Baltic states, forcibly incorporated in 1940, declared independence and achieved it despite initial Soviet resistance. Ukraine and Belarus followed. Even Russia itself under Boris Yeltsin essentially seceded from the USSR. When hardline communists attempted a coup in August 1991 to preserve the Soviet Union, their failure sealed its fate. On December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union formally ceased to exist, replaced by 15 independent states. The Cold War had ended not with the nuclear catastrophe many had feared, but with the internal collapse of one side exhausted by military competition it could not afford, discredited by economic failure, and rejected by populations who no longer believed in the ideology that justified their sacrifices. Yet the post-communist transition proved far more difficult than the euphoric crowds of 1989 anticipated. The economic shock of moving from planned to market economies caused tremendous hardship as state enterprises collapsed, savings were wiped out by inflation, and social safety nets disintegrated. Crime and corruption flourished in the absence of effective state institutions. Life expectancy actually declined in Russia and other former Soviet republics during the 1990s, an unprecedented peacetime catastrophe. The optimism that democracy and capitalism would quickly bring prosperity and freedom proved naive, as elites from the old regime often adapted successfully to new conditions while ordinary people struggled. The disintegration of Yugoslavia into its constituent republics triggered the worst violence in Europe since World War II. Slovenia and Croatia declared independence in 1991, leading to wars with Serbian forces determined to maintain Yugoslav unity or create a Greater Serbia. Bosnia-Herzegovina descended into horrific conflict between Bosniaks, Serbs and Croats, characterized by ethnic cleansing, mass rape, and genocide, including the Srebrenica massacre, where more than 8,000 Bosniak men and boys were murdered. The wars in the Balkans through the 1990s claimed hundreds of thousands of lives and created millions of refugees, demonstrating that ethnic nationalism could be as destructive as the communist ideology it replaced. NATO intervention eventually ended the worst violence, but the ethnic tensions that fueled the wars remained unresolved. Czechoslovakia dissolved peacefully in 1993, splitting into Czech Republic and Slovakia through negotiated separation called the Velvet Divorce. Unlike Yugoslavia, the separation occurred without violence, though it left both successor states smaller and less influential than Czechoslovakia had been. Both countries successfully transitioned to democracy and market economies, eventually joining the European Union and NATO. Integration into Western institutions that seemed to fulfill the democratic aspirations of 1989. The 21st century has brought new challenges and dynamics to the Slavic world. Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Slovenia, Croatia, and Bulgaria have joined the European Union, integrating their economies with Western Europe and accepting substantial funding for development while struggling with questions about sovereignty and cultural identity. These countries have largely succeeded in building functioning democracies and market economies, though democratic backsliding in Poland and elsewhere raises concerns about the durability of liberal institutions. Russia under Vladimir Putin has taken a very different path, evolving from the chaos of the 1990s toward an increasingly authoritarian system that blends elements of traditional Russian autocracy, Soviet practices, and nationalist ideology. Putin has restored stability and improved living standards for many Russians, but at the cost of political freedoms, independent media, and genuine democracy. Russia's annexation of Crimea from Ukraine in 2014 and its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 have created the worst European conflict since World War II, killing hundreds of thousands and displacing millions. These actions reflect Russian imperial ambitions and resentment of Western expansion eastward, particularly NATO enlargement that Russia views as threatening. Ukraine's struggle for independence and sovereignty has made it the central battleground for competing visions of the Slavic future. Ukraine has sought to build a democratic state aligned with Europe, rejecting Russia's claim to a sphere of influence over former Soviet territories. The conflict has reinforced Ukrainian national identity, paradoxically strengthening the very Ukrainian nationalism that Russian propaganda claimed did not exist. The war's outcome remains uncertain as of 2025, but it has already ensured that relations between Russia and the West, and between Russia and most other Slavic states, will remain hostile for years or decades to come. Belarus under Alexander Lukashenko remains Europe's last dictatorship, closely aligned with Russia and maintaining many Soviet-era practices. Protests in 2020, following fraudulent elections, were brutally suppressed, demonstrating that authoritarian rule persists even as most former communist states have democratized. Serbia has maintained connections with Russia while pursuing eventual EU membership, attempting to balance between East and West. The Orthodox-Catholic divide continues to matter politically, with Orthodox states often maintaining closer ties with Russia, while Catholic states look westward. The Slavic peoples today number over 300 million, making them one of the largest language families on Earth. They have survived centuries of imperial domination, world wars, totalitarianism, and ethnic conflicts. They have produced remarkable cultural achievements, literature, music, science, and art that have enriched world civilization. They have experimented with diverse political systems, from czarist autocracy through communist dictatorship to liberal democracy, learning through painful experience what works and what fails. The diversity among Slavic nations remains striking, as similar origins and linguistic kinship have not prevented them from following very different historical paths and developing distinct national identities. As the Slavic world moves deeper into the 21st century, it faces challenges familiar to all of Europe and beyond. Demographic decline as birth rates fall below replacement level, emigration of young people seeking opportunities elsewhere, tension between national identity and globalization, the impacts of climate change, and technological transformation. The question of whether Slavic civilization represents something distinctive, a set of values and approaches that differ meaningfully from Western European patterns, continues to be debated. The relationship between democracy and tradition, between individual liberty and collective identity, between national sovereignty and international integration, animates political discourse across Slavic lands. The story of the Slavs is ultimately a story of resilience and adaptation, of peoples who emerged from obscurity to populate half a continent, who built kingdoms and empires, who survived catastrophes that would have destroyed lesser cultures, who who continue to shape European and world history through their actions and choices. From the primordial forests of the early homeland through the golden age of medieval kingdoms, through centuries of imperial domination, through the horrors of 20th century totalitarianism and warfare, to the uncertain present and unknowable future, the Slavic peoples have endured. Their languages continue to be spoken, their cultures continue to evolve, and their descendants continue to grapple with questions of identity, purpose, and destiny that have no easy answers but demand engagement nonetheless. The history of the Slavs is not finished but ongoing, being written in the present by people inheriting both the triumphs and traumas of their ancestors, seeking to build futures worthy of the sacrifices that made their existence possible.